For 11 minutes in the early hours of March 14, 1987, the air around Fort Peck Lake went silent in a way that silence shouldn't exist. Fort Peck Lake sits in the northeast corner of Montana, a massive reservoir created in 1937 when the Army Corps of Engineers dammed the Missouri River. It stretches 134 miles across prairie and badlands, holding more water than any other reservoir in the state. The lake was built during the Great Depression, employing thousands, and when it filled, it swallowed towns, roads, and homesteads beneath 245 feet of cold water. The dam itself is over 4 miles long, one of the largest earthen dams in the world. Around it, the landscape is sparse and unforgiving. Cottonwoods line the shore in places, but beyond that, it's mostly grassland, rolling hills, and long stretches of nothing. The winters are brutal. The summers are short. The population in the surrounding counties hovers around 6,000, spread thin across an area larger than some eastern states. By the mid-'80s, Fort Peck had become a hub for radio transmission. The isolation made it ideal. 5 FM stations and 3 AM broadcasters operated from towers scattered around the lake's perimeter, serving ranchers, truckers, and the handful of small towns within range. The towers stood on ridges and plateaus, their red lights blinking through the night like distant sentries. Most were automated by then, requiring only periodic maintenance and the occasional live operator during graveyard shifts. On the night of March 13, 1987, 3 operators were on duty across 3 separate stations. The weather was clear. Temperature hovered around 28 degrees. There was no storm activity, no solar flare warnings, no equipment malfunctions logged in the hours before. At exactly 3:47 a.m., all 8 stations within a 40-mile radius of Fort Peck Lake went off the air simultaneously, not to static, not to dead signal hum, to nothing. The phenomenon was first noticed by a long-haul trucker named Vincent Coolman, who was driving eastbound on Highway 2 near Glasgow. He had been listening to KROK-FM, a station out of Wolf Point, when the music cut out mid-song. He reached for the dial, scanning through the preset stations. Every single one was silent. Not the crackle of interference, not the distant bleed of another frequency. Just empty air, as if the radio itself had stopped working. Coolman pulled over and checked his CB. It was operational. He tried his radio again. Still nothing. He noted the time on his dashboard clock, 3:49 a.m. At the transmission tower for KFLN AM, located on a low plateau 7 miles south of the dam, operator David Hargrove was drinking coffee and reading a paperback when the silence started. He didn't notice it immediately. The station was running automated programming, a loop of country classics and agriculture reports. Hargrove's job was to monitor levels, log any irregularities, and switch to backup power if needed. But when he glanced up at the console around 3:50 a.m., he saw that the transmission meters were flatlined, not spiking, not fluctuating, just dead. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the red beacon atop the tower was still blinking. Power was fine. He checked the board. Everything looked normal. He picked up the landline to call the main office in Billings, but before he dialed, the meters jumped back to life. Music resumed mid-verse. Hargrove looked at the clock. 3:58 a.m. He sat back down and wrote a brief note in the log. Signal drop, cause unknown, duration approximately 8 minutes. He couldn't remember what he'd been thinking about during those 8 minutes. At KWPR-FM, 18 miles northwest, operator Sandra Ibarra experienced the same thing. She later told a friend that she'd been looking at the console one moment, then suddenly it was 11 minutes later and she was still staring at it, but she had no memory of the time in between. She described it as similar to highway hypnosis, that feeling of arriving somewhere without remembering the drive. When she reviewed the station log later, she found that she'd written nothing during that span. Her coffee, she said, was still warm. The third operator, a man named Thomas Pryor, was stationed at an AM tower near Fort Peck itself. His account was slightly different. He claimed he'd gotten up to check the transmitter at around 3:45 a.m. and had walked outside. He remembered standing near the base of the tower, looking south toward the lake. The next thing he remembered was being back inside at his desk, the clock reading 3:58 a.m. He couldn't recall walking back. He couldn't recall hearing anything, seeing anything, or thinking anything during the missing time. When asked later, he said it felt less like forgetting and more like the time simply hadn't happened. By dawn, 6 other stations had confirmed the same event. Automated systems had logged the outage at exactly 3:47 a.m. Transmission had resumed at 3:58 a.m., 11 minutes, no variation. Within a week, the Federal Communications Commission opened an investigation. Engineers were dispatched from Denver and Seattle to inspect the towers, test the equipment, and interview the operators. What they found was nothing. Every transmitter, every antenna, every backup generator, and relay system was functioning perfectly. There was no evidence of power surges, electromagnetic interference, or atmospheric distortion. The equipment logs showed normal operation before and after the event, with only the flat line during the 11-minute window. One engineer noted that the simultaneous failure across 8 independent systems, all on different frequencies and power sources, was statistically implausible. Another described it as a coordinated dropout, but couldn't explain what would coordinate it. Weather data from that night showed clear skies, no lightning, no unusual atmospheric pressure. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reviewed satellite imagery and found nothing abnormal. Solar activity was low. The Air Force confirmed no military exercises in the region. The local power company reported no outages or fluctuations in the grid. The most unsettling detail emerged during the operator interviews. All 3 who had been on duty that night described the same sensation, a complete absence of memory during the 11 minutes. Not forgetfulness, but a blank space, as if those minutes had been extracted. Hargrove told investigators he'd felt awake, but not present. Ibarra said it was like standing in a room with no doors. Pryor refused to elaborate beyond his initial statement, saying only that he didn't want to think about it anymore. The FCC's final report, filed in July of 1987, attributed the incident to an unidentified atmospheric anomaly. The file noted that while the simultaneous signal loss was unusual, it posed no ongoing threat to broadcast integrity. The report recommended continued monitoring but no further action. It was classified as a low-priority event. The case was closed. But the story didn't end there. In the months following the incident, residents around Fort Peck Lake began reporting strange occurrences on the radio. Several people claimed that late at night, usually between 3 and 4 a.m., they would hear brief bursts of silence on the same frequencies that had gone dead in March. The silence would last only a few seconds, sometimes less, but it was noticeable. A rancher named Eugene Pallister, who lived near the town of Nashua, said he'd been listening to a call-in show one night in September when the audio cut out for what he estimated was 5 seconds. When it returned, the host was mid-sentence, as if no time had passed. Pallister checked his watch. The time matched. By 1988, 2 of the 3 operators from that night had left their jobs. Hargrove took a position with a station in Billings. Ibarra moved to Oregon. Pryor stayed in the area but stopped working in radio entirely. He took a job at a grain elevator in Glasgow and, according to people who knew him, rarely talked about his time at the tower. In 1992, a freelance journalist named Rita Vasquez attempted to investigate the incident for a regional magazine. She requested the FCC file under the Freedom of Information Act and received a heavily redacted document. Most of the technical data had been blacked out. The operator interviews were summarized in a single paragraph. Vasquez drove to Fort Peck and spoke with locals, but found few willing to discuss it on record. One former station manager told her, off the record, that the FCC had quietly recommended all stations in the area avoid broadcasting on certain frequencies during the 3 a.m. hour. When Vasquez asked why, the manager said he didn't know. He'd just followed the recommendation. Vasquez also tried to contact the 3 operators. Hargrove declined an interview. Ibarra didn't respond. Pryor agreed to meet but canceled the day before, leaving a voicemail that Vasquez described as tense. Her article was never published. Today, the towers around Fort Peck Lake still broadcast. Most have been upgraded, automated further, their operations monitored remotely from offices hundreds of miles away. The red lights still blink through the night. Truckers still scan the dial. Ranchers still tune in for weather reports and wheat prices. But the frequency range that went silent in 1987 is rarely used anymore. Not because of regulation, not because of interference, just because. And on certain nights, when the air is still and the lake is dark, people say you can hear it. Not static, not hum, just the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. The clock on the dashboard still reads 3:47. There is a stretch of pavement on Going to the Sun Road that refuses to forget winter. Going to the Sun Road cuts through the heart of Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana, a 50-mile engineering marvel completed in 1933. It climbs from the dense cedar forests of the western valleys, crosses the Continental Divide at Logan Pass, and descends into the windswept plains on the eastern side. The road reaches elevations above 6,600 feet, clinging to cliff faces and threading through tunnels carved into ancient stone. For much of the year, it's buried under snow. The Park Service closes it every October and doesn't reopen it until late June or early July, depending on how long the plows take to clear the drifts. Some winters leave snow 20 feet deep at the pass. The section in question sits approximately 2 miles west of Logan Pass, along a sweeping curve known informally among maintenance crews as Marker 17. The road here hugs the southern face of the Piegan Mountain Massif, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side and a vertical wall of glacial rock on the other. Meltwater streams cross the pavement in spring. Wild flowers bloom in the alpine meadows above. It's a place tourists stop to photograph bighorn sheep and take in views of the Livingston Range. But the pavement itself stays cold. The anomaly was first noted in the summer of 1971 by a road crew supervisor named Gerald Ottinger. His team had been resurfacing sections of the road damaged by the previous winter's freeze-thaw cycles. On July 23rd, Ottinger recorded in his daily log that a roughly 12-foot section of asphalt near Marker 17 had a thin layer of frost on it, despite an ambient air temperature of 68 degrees. He assumed it was runoff from a snowmelt pocket higher up the mountain. The crew scraped it off and continued working. The next morning, the frost was back. Same location, same pattern. Ottinger's notes describe it as unusual, but not alarming. Mountain weather is unpredictable. Microclimates exist where cold air settles in pockets and refuses to move. The crew scraped the frost again and laid new asphalt over the section. By the time they returned a week later to inspect their work, the frost had reappeared on top of the fresh pavement. By August, the pattern had become consistent. Every morning, regardless of temperature, a thin layer of frost covered the same 12-foot section of road. It melted by mid-afternoon when direct sunlight hit the pavement, but it returned the following dawn. Ottinger brought it to the attention of the park's chief engineer, a man named Alistair Drummond, who visited the site in early September. Drummond's report, filed on September 9, 1971, noted the frost but attributed it to probable subterranean water flow and localized thermal inversion. He recommended monitoring, but took no further action. What Drummond's report didn't mention and what Ottinger would later describe to a ranger in an unofficial conversation, was the shape of the frost. It wasn't uniform. It formed in distinct patterns, irregular but repeating. Ottinger said it reminded him of handprints, not clear impressions, but the kind of smudged outlines you'd see on glass. He counted 7 distinct shapes, all roughly the size of adult human hands, spread across the frozen section in positions that didn't change day to day. The road closed for winter in mid-October, as it always does. When crews returned in June of 1972 to begin clearing snow, they found the frost waiting beneath 15 feet of compacted ice and snow. After the section was fully plowed and exposed to open air, the patterns returned within 24 hours. Same positions, same shapes. Over the next 5 years, the frost became a quiet fixture of the road's maintenance schedule. Crews grew accustomed to it. Some scraped it off out of habit. Others left it alone. A ranger named Lillian Kovach, who patrolled that section of the park from 1973 to 1976, said she'd seen it dozens of times and always felt uneasy about it. She described the frost as too precise and said the way it reformed in the exact same configuration each time felt wrong. Kovach mentioned it to a few colleagues, but none took it seriously. Mountain ice does strange things. In 1978, a geologist from the University of Montana named Dr. Raymond Toland visited the site as part of a broader study on glacial melt patterns in the park. He took soil samples, measured ground temperature at various depths, and used thermal imaging equipment to scan the area. His findings were inconclusive. The ground temperature beneath the frost section was slightly cooler than surrounding areas by approximately 3 degrees, but not enough to explain sustained frost formation in summer conditions. Toland noted in his field journal that the temperature differential suggests an unidentified cold source at shallow depth, but he couldn't locate one. He recommended further study. No follow-up was ever conducted. By the early 1980s, the frost had become something of an open secret among long-term park employees. A maintenance worker named Joseph Harkin, who worked at Glacier from 1980 to 1994, said that newer crew members were often surprised when they encountered it for the first time, but veterans just shrugged it off. Harkin himself said he'd stopped thinking about it after his first season. It was just part of the road. He did mention, however, that no one liked working that section alone. He couldn't explain why. It was just an unspoken thing. In 1989, a tourist from Wisconsin named Patricia Lindgren stopped at Marker 17 to photograph the view. It was early August. She later wrote a letter to the park superintendent describing what she'd seen. According to Lindgren, she'd noticed frost on the pavement and assumed it was residual snow. When she knelt down to touch it, she said it felt warmer than it should have been. Not warm, but not cold either. She described it as room temperature frost, which didn't make sense to her. She took a photograph. When she had the film developed weeks later, the frost didn't appear in the image, just dry, dark pavement. The park's official response to Lindgren's letter, dated September 12, 1989, thanked her for her interest and explained that mountain environments often produce optical illusions due to altitude and atmospheric conditions. The letter was polite and brief. Lindgren never followed up. In 1992, a request was made to the National Park Service archives to review historical patrol logs for the Marker 17 area. The request came from an independent researcher named Marcus Eberly, who was compiling data on unusual geological phenomena in national parks. What Eberly discovered was a gap. Patrol logs for the 2-mile section surrounding Marker 17 were missing for the years 1957 through 1971. Logs existed for the years before and after, but those 14 years were absent from the Dong-an. When Eberly inquired, he was told the records had likely been lost during an archive reorganization in the mid-70s. He filed a formal request for any backup copies. None were found. Eberly also requested maintenance records for the same period. He received a partial file covering 1963 to 1968. The records showed routine snow removal and minor repairs. There was no mention of frost, temperature anomalies, or unusual conditions. But there was a note, dated May 19, 1967, written by a supervisor whose name was redacted. The note read, "Crew refuses to work western section past Logan, reassigned to eastern route." No explanation was provided. Eberly's research was never published. He told a colleague in 1994 that the Park Service had been uncooperative and that he'd decided to move on to other projects. He died in 2003. His files were donated to the University of Washington, but the section on Glacier National Park was notably thin. The frost still appears every summer. Maintenance crews still document it in their logs, though the reports are perfunctory now. A typical entry might read, "Frost observed at marker 17, no action taken." Thermal imaging equipment has improved significantly since Toland's study in the 70s, but no agency has authorized a new investigation. The Park Service maintains that the phenomenon is a natural result of subsurface water and microclimate conditions. When pressed, officials say the matter has been studied and found to be geologically insignificant, but the handprints remain, 7 of them, always in the same positions, always returning by dawn. Tourists pass the spot every day during the summer season, most unaware that the pavement beneath their feet is several degrees colder than it should be. Some stop to take pictures. Some notice the thin layer of frost and wonder about it briefly before moving on. Rangers, when asked, offer the same explanation the Park Service has used for decades. Mountain weather, cold pockets, nothing unusual. Off the record, some tell a different story. A ranger who worked the Logan Pass area for 12 years and requested anonymity said that he'd been told during his first week on the job not to linger at marker 17 after dusk. When he asked why, his supervisor said it was just a good habit. The ranger said he'd worked plenty of isolated stretches in the park, but that section always felt different. He couldn't articulate how, just different. The frost doesn't grow, it doesn't spread, it simply persists, waiting in the same configuration it has held for more than 50 years. And every spring when the plows clear away the winter snow and expose the bare pavement to open sky, the shapes reappear like a signature written in ice. No one knows whose hands they are. The dead began receiving mail in Ismay, Montana on February 9, 1994. Ismay sits in the southeastern corner of Montana near the North Dakota border, in a stretch of high plains prairie that seems to go on forever in every direction. The town was established in 1908 as a railroad stop along the Milwaukee Road Line, named after the daughter of a railroad executive. At its peak in the 1920s, Ismay had around 300 residents, a grain elevator, a general store, and a small schoolhouse. By the 1990s, the population had dwindled to 22. The railroad had been abandoned decades earlier. Most of the buildings stood empty. The post office operated out of a converted garage, open 3 days a week, staffed by a single postmaster named Grace Holloway. The landscape around Ismay is flat and treeless, marked by occasional buttes and dry creek beds that only fill during spring runoff. The wind is constant. The nearest town of any size is Ekalaka, 28 miles to the southwest. Cell phone service wouldn't reach the area for another decade. In winter, the roads sometimes closed for days at a time. People who lived there did so because their families always had, or because they preferred isolation. The town would later gain brief national attention in 1998 when it temporarily changed its name to Joe, Montana as part of a promotional stunt with the football player. But in 1994, Ismay was just another dying prairie town that most maps had already stopped printing. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday. Grace Holloway found it in the morning delivery bag, which came by courier from Miles City 3 times a week. The envelope was standard white business size, addressed in neat blue ink to Margaret Kelso, Ismay, MT 59336. No street address, just the name and town. The postmark read Ismay, dated February 8, 1994. There was no return address. Holloway recognized the name immediately. Margaret Kelso had lived in Ismay from 1912 until her death in 1947. She'd been a school teacher, well-liked, buried in the small cemetery 2 miles east of town. Holloway assumed it was a mistake. Perhaps someone who didn't know Margaret had died. She set the letter aside. By Friday, 4 more letters had arrived, all similarly addressed to names Holloway recognized as former residents, all deceased. Walter Finch, who died in 1962. Elizabeth Strand, dead since 1953. James and Dorothy Novak, both gone before 1970. Each envelope bore the same neat handwriting, the same Ismay postmark with current dates, and no return address. Holloway opened one. Inside was a single sheet of white paper with one sentence written in the same blue ink. "We're still counting." Nothing else. No signature, no explanation. Over the next 2 weeks, 17 more letters arrived, all addressed to people who know. Longer lived in Ismay. Some had been dead for decades. Others had simply moved away in the 1930s or 40s when the railroad jobs dried up and families scattered to larger towns. Holloway kept a list. She consulted old census records and the town's unofficial history, compiled years earlier by a local woman named Edith Rourke. Every name on the envelopes corresponded to someone who had lived in Ismay between 1908 and 1960. But the postmarks were all current, and they all said Ismay. By March, word had spread among the 22 residents. A rancher named Theodore Baca, whose family had been in the area since the town's founding, came to the post office and asked to see the letters. He recognized several names. His grandfather, Henrik Baca, received one. Henrik had died in 1939. Theodore opened it. Same message. "We're still counting." A woman named Irene Mosley, one of the town's oldest residents at 78, received a letter addressed to her aunt, Clara Mosley, who had died in childbirth in 1924. Irene didn't open it. She said later that she didn't want to know what it said. She burned it in her wood stove. By April, the letters were arriving almost daily. The Ismay postmark appeared on everyone, despite the fact that Ismay's post office had no cancellation equipment. Outgoing mail from Ismay was always driven to Miles City to be processed. The Postal Service in Miles City confirmed they weren't processing any mail with Ismay postmarks. The regional office in Billings opened an inquiry. A postal inspector named Derek Lundquist visited Ismay in late April. He examined the letters, interviewed Holloway, and inspected the post office. His report, filed May 2, 1994, noted several irregularities. The postmarks, while appearing authentic, used a stamp style that had been discontinued in 1973. The ink analysis suggested a fountain pen, uncommon by the 90s. Most concerning was the handwriting. Lundquist had brought samples from 14 different letters. A forensic document examiner in Billings confirmed that all 14 were written by the same hand. The loops and slant were identical across every page. Lundquist also noted that the Postal Service had no record of the letters entering the mail system at any point. They simply appeared in the Ismay delivery bag. The courier who drove the route from Miles City, a man named Philip Travers, said he'd never seen anyone add anything to the bag between stops. The bag was sealed when he picked it up and sealed when he delivered it. The letters continued through May and June. By the end of June, Holloway had received 83 letters addressed to 64 different people, none of whom currently lived in Ismay. Every letter contained the same message. The handwriting never varied. On July 1st, the letters stopped. No explanation, No final message. They simply ceased appearing in the delivery bag. Holloway waited for 2 weeks, expecting them to resume, but nothing came. By August, she reported the cessation to Lundquist, who made a note in his file, but took no further action. The case was classified as irregular mail delivery with unknown origin and effectively closed. Attempts to trace the letters led nowhere. The paper was standard stock available at any office supply store. The envelopes were a common brand sold throughout the region. The ink was a standard blue fountain pen ink, impossible to trace to a specific source. Handwriting analysis concluded the writer was educated, methodical, and likely elderly based on the formal script style. No matches were found in any criminal or postal databases. Several theories emerged among the residents. Some believed it was an elaborate prank, though no one could explain how the letters appeared in sealed mail bags or who would know the names of people dead for 50 years. Others thought it might be a delayed delivery of old mail somehow trapped in the system, though this didn't account for the current postmarks or the identical messages. A few believed something stranger was at work. Edith Rourke, who had compiled the town history, pointed out that many of the names on the letters corresponded to people who had died during Ismay's early years, accidents, illnesses, the hardships of frontier life. She noted that the phrase "we're still counting" suggested an ongoing tally, though of what she couldn't say. Theodore Baca mentioned that his grandfather Henrik had been part of a surveying crew in 1938, mapping property boundaries for the county. Henrik had died the following winter of pneumonia. Theodore wondered if the counting had something to do with that work, though he admitted he was only guessing. In 2006, a graduate student from the University of Montana named Angela Ferraro attempted to research the incident for her thesis on rural postal anomalies. She tracked down Grace Holloway, who by then had retired and moved to Billings. Holloway provided copies of her logs and several of the original letters, which she'd kept despite instructions to destroy them. Ferraro also interviewed 3 of the remaining Ismay residents, though by then the town's population had dropped to 8. Ferraro's thesis included a chapter on the Ismay letters, but she reached no conclusions. She noted the statistical improbability of the letters appearing without entering the documented mail system and the oddity of the identical handwriting across months of correspondence. Her advisor suggested she focus on more verifiable incidents. The chapter was revised, and the Ismay case reduced to a footnote. The letters themselves are stored in Holloway's personal files, now held by her daughter in Billings. They've never been publicly displayed. Requests to examine them have been declined. The Postal Service considers the matter closed. In 2019, the last permanent resident of Ismay moved away. The town still appears on some maps, but the post office closed in 2007. The buildings are empty. The cemetery remains, maintained by the county. And somewhere in those 83 letters, written in the same careful hand, the same message repeated, "We're still counting." No one knows what the count reached. No one knows if it ever stopped. Something at the bottom of Flathead Lake moved between 1960 and 2003, and no one can explain what it was or where it went. Flathead Lake sits in the northwest corner of Montana, nestled between the Mission Mountains to the east and the Salish Range to the west. It's the largest natural freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River, covering nearly 200 square miles, with a shoreline that stretches over 160 miles. The lake was formed roughly 12,000 years ago when the Cordilleran ice sheet retreated, leaving behind a massive glacial trough filled by the Flathead River. The water is remarkably clear, visibility often exceeds 30 feet, and the depth varies dramatically. Shallow bays along the southern end give way to steep underwater cliffs in the north, where the lake bottom drops away into near total darkness. The lake has been home to the Salish and Kootenai peoples for thousands of years. Their oral histories describe the lake as a place of power and caution, particularly its deepest sections. Early white settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, and by the early 1900s, steamboats were crossing the lake regularly. In 1938, the Kerr Dam was completed on the Flathead River, raising the lake's water level by 10 feet and expanding its surface area. The lake became a hub for recreation, fishing, and tourism. Scientific surveys of the lake began in earnest in the 1950s. In 1960, the U.S. Geological Survey conducted a comprehensive bathymetric mapping project using sonar equipment mounted on a research vessel. The survey identified the lake's deepest point at 371 feet, located approximately 2 miles offshore from the town of Big Fork in the northeastern quadrant of the lake. The coordinates were recorded, charted, and published in the USGS report filed in 1961. Those measurements remained the official record for over 40 years. In June of 2003, a team from the Montana Department of Natural Resources returned to Flathead Lake to update the bathymetric maps using modern sonar technology. The team was led by a hydrologist named Dr. Alan Vescio, who had worked on similar projects across the state. The goal was to create high-resolution maps of the lake bed to assist with ecological studies and sediment analysis. The team used a multi-beam sonar system capable of mapping the lake floor in far greater detail than the equipment available in 1960. On June 17, 2003, the team began their survey in the northeastern section of the lake, near where the 1960 survey had identified the deepest point. They expected to confirm the existing data and move on. Instead, their sonar showed a maximum depth of 341 feet at the coordinates from the 1960 survey. The deepest point, according to their equipment, had moved. The new location was approximately 200 feet to the southwest, still in deep water, but in a completely different position. At this new site, the sonar recorded a depth of 380 feet, 9 feet deeper than the previous record. Dr. Vescio's team ran the scan 3 times to confirm. Each pass showed the same result. The deepest point of Flathead Lake was no longer where it had been charted 4 decades earlier. Dr. Vescio's initial assumption was that the 1960 survey had been inaccurate. Sonar technology from that era was less precise, and small errors in positioning were common. But when he reviewed the original USGS data, he found it had been triple-checked and verified. The 1960 survey had used multiple passes and cross-references with coastal landmarks. The margin of error would have been, at most, 20 to 30 feet, not 200. The team continued mapping the area. On June 19th, while surveying the new deepest point, the sonar detected an anomaly. At a depth of approximately 380 feet, the equipment registered a large, solid mass. The sonar image showed an object roughly 50 feet in length and 20 feet in height sitting on the lake floor. Its shape was irregular but distinct, not consistent with natural rock formations or sediment patterns. The object appeared to be stationary. Dr. Vescio decided to make a second pass over the same coordinates to capture a clearer image. The boat returned to the exact position using GPS. The sonar was deployed again. This time, the scan showed nothing but the lake floor. The object was gone. The depth reading was unchanged at 380 feet, but the mass that had appeared minutes earlier was no longer detectable. The team ran 4 more passes over the area. None detected the object. Dr. Vescio reviewed the data logs from the first scan. The image was clear and unambiguous. Something had been there. He checked the equipment for malfunctions. Everything was functioning normally. A member of the survey team, a technician named Rita Kowalski, later described the moment as unsettling. She said the team had been joking about finding a sunken boat or maybe a large log, but when the object vanished on the second pass, the mood changed. No one said much after that. They finished the day's work and returned to shore. Dr. Vecchio filed his preliminary report with the Department of Natural Resources on June 25, 2003. The report noted the discrepancy between the 1960 depth measurements and the current findings. It also included a section on the sonar anomaly describing the detected mass and its subsequent disappearance. Vecchio recommended follow-up dives to investigate the area directly, but he acknowledged that the depth would make such dives difficult and expensive. The report was reviewed by the department's senior hydrologist, Dr. Francine Delgado, who had overseen lake surveys across Montana for 2 decades. Delgado's written response, dated July 8, 2003, acknowledged the depth discrepancy, but attributed it to probable tectonic settling or sediment redistribution over time. Regarding the sonar anomaly, she noted that transient sonar returns are not uncommon in deep water environments and may result from temperature gradients, organic debris, or equipment interference. She did not recommend further investigation. Dr. Vecchio disagreed. In a follow-up memo dated July 15th, he pointed out that Flathead Lake sits in a geologically stable region with no significant seismic activity recorded in the past century. He also noted that the sonar anomaly had been detected under clear conditions with no equipment malfunctions. He requested permission to return to the site with underwater camera equipment. His request was denied due to budget constraints. Over the following months, Vecchio reached out to colleagues at the University of Montana and Montana State University, hoping to generate interest in a follow-up study. A geologist named Dr. Patrick Monroe reviewed Vecchio's data and agreed that the depth shift was unusual. Monroe noted that while sediment accumulation could theoretically change lake depths over time, it would be a gradual process, not a sudden displacement. He also couldn't explain how sediment would move the deepest point 200 feet in a lateral direction. Monroe suggested that subsurface geological features, such as underwater landslides or glacial erratics, might account for the anomaly, but he admitted this was speculative. He encouraged Vecchio to publish his findings in a regional geology journal. Vecchio prepared a paper, but never submitted it. In an email to a colleague dated November 2003, he wrote that he'd been advised by his department to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to inconclusive data. In 2004, a recreational diver and local resident named Gordon Thibault attempted to explore the area near the new deepest point. Thibault was an experienced technical diver with certifications for depths exceeding 200 feet. On August 7, 2004, he descended to approximately 280 feet using mixed gas equipment. He later described the lake floor as barren and featureless with fine sediment and scattered rocks. He saw no evidence of the object detected in the sonar scan. Thibault made 2 additional dives in the area over the next week. Both were similarly uneventful. However, Thibault did note one peculiarity. He said the water temperature at depth was unusually cold, even for Flathead Lake, which is fed by glacial melt. He recorded a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 280 feet, several degrees colder than expected for that depth and season. He mentioned this in a post on a regional diving forum, but it drew little response. In 2007, the Montana Department of Natural Resources conducted another bathymetric survey of Flathead Lake, this time as part of a statewide lake assessment program. The survey confirmed the 2003 findings. The deepest point remained at 380 feet in the southwestern position. No anomalies were detected. The report made no reference to the 1960 survey or the discrepancy in location. Dr. Vecchio retired from the Department of Natural Resources in 2010. In a brief interview with a regional newspaper marking his retirement, He mentioned the Flathead Lake survey as one of the most puzzling projects of his career. He declined to elaborate, saying only that lakes have their secrets. In 2015, a journalist named Marcus Oleska attempted to investigate the Flathead Lake depth anomaly for a feature article on unexplained phenomena in Montana. Oleska reviewed Vescio's original report, which had been made available through a public records request, and interviewed Vescio by phone. Vescio confirmed the details, but said he had no new information. Oleska also contacted Dr. Delgado, who had since retired. She did not respond to interview requests. Oleska's article was published in a regional magazine in October 2015. It included the sonar image from the June 19, 2003 scan showing the mass at 380 feet. The article generated some local interest, but no official response from state agencies. Oleska followed up with a request for any subsequent surveys or studies related to the anomaly. He was told none existed. Today, Flathead Lake remains one of Montana's most popular destinations. Thousands of visitors come each year to boat, fish, and swim in its clear waters. The lake's official depth is listed as 380 feet, based on the 2003 survey. The 1960 measurement is rarely mentioned. The sonar image from June 19, 2003, remains in the Department of Natural Resources archives. It shows a clear, solid mass at the lake's deepest point, 50 feet long, 20 feet high, stationary for the duration of one sonar pass, and then gone. Divers still descend into the lake's depths, searching for clarity in water that reveals everything and nothing at once. The cold presses in, the light fades, and somewhere below, the bottom waits. Whether it's where it's always been or where it moved to, no one can say for certain. There are 7 trees in the Bitterroot National Forest that should not exist, marked with a symbol no one can explain. The Bitterroot Range runs along the border between Montana and Idaho, a rugged spine of granite peaks and deep valleys carved by glaciers and rivers over millennia. The Bitterroot National Forest, established in 1908, covers over 1.6 million acres of wilderness. Ponderosa pine dominates the lower elevations, mixed with Douglas fir and lodgepole pine higher up. The terrain is steep and difficult. Trails wind through canyons and ridge lines that see few visitors outside of hunting season. Winters are harsh. Summers bring drought and the constant threat of wildfire. The forest has a long history of human presence. The Salish people traveled through these mountains for thousands of years, following game and seasonal migration routes. Lewis and Clark passed through the Bitterroot Valley in 1805. By the late 1800s, trappers, miners, and loggers had moved into the area, carving rough trails and establishing scattered camps. The U.S. Forest Service began systematic documentation of the region in the early 1900s, photographing trails, marking boundaries, and cataloging resources. One such trail, known simply as the Bitterroot Trail, runs for approximately 12 miles along a ridgeline south of Lost Horse Creek. It's listed on modern maps, but rarely maintained. Hikers who use it describe it as overgrown and difficult to follow in places. The elevation ranges from 4,500 feet to just over 6,200 feet. The forest is dense, visibility is limited, cell service is non-existent. The 7 trees stand at intervals along this trail, each approximately half a mile apart. They are ponderosa pines, large and old, their trunks thick and bark deeply furrowed. On each tree, at roughly eye level, is carved a symbol, a circle containing what appears to be an eye at the center, surrounded by 4 lines radiating outward like compass points. The carving is roughly 6 inches in diameter. The lines are clean and precise. The symbol first appeared in photographic records in 1909. A Forest Service surveyor named Raymond Kelleher was documenting trails in the Bitterroot Range and took a series of photographs along what would later be designated the Bitterroot Trail. In one image, dated August 12, 1909, a large ponderosa pine is visible in the background. The symbol is clearly present on the trunk. Kelleher's field notes make no mention of it. The photographs were filed with the Forest Service's Regional Archive in Missoula and largely forgotten. In 1954, during a post-war effort to update trail maps, a ranger named Luther Finch retraced several historic routes, including the Bitterroot Trail. Finch took photographs at various points along the trail. In 4 of his images, the symbol appears on different ponderosa pines. Finch's report, filed October 3, 1954, noted unusual trail markings of unknown origin, but provided no further detail. The Bitterroot National Forest experienced a catastrophic wildfire in the summer of 1988. The Canyon Creek Fire, as it was later named, burned over 240,000 acres across the Bitterroot and Selway Bitterroot wilderness areas. The fire reached the ridgeline where the Bitterroot Trail runs and consumed vast sections of forest. Forest Service records from that year document complete burn coverage along the trail corridor. Aerial photographs taken in September 1988 show charred earth and skeletal remains of trees across the entire area. In 2018, a forestry graduate student named Olivia Marquette was conducting research on post-fire forest recovery in the Bitterroot Range. She hiked the Bitterroot Trail in late June, documenting tree growth and vegetation patterns. Approximately 3 miles into the trail, she encountered a large ponderosa pine with a symbol carved into its trunk. She photographed it, assuming it was a recent trail marker or vandalism. Over the next 8 miles, she found 6 more trees with identical symbols. Marquette's photographs matched the locations and descriptions from the 1954 images. When she returned to the University of Montana and reviewed historical records, she discovered the 1909 photograph as well. She realized she was looking at the same trees, or trees in the exact same positions with identical carvings, that had been photographed over a century earlier, and they were standing in an area that had been completely burned in 1988. Marquette returned to the trail in July with a colleague, a dendrochronologist named Dr. Felix Bernstein. Using an increment borer, they extracted core samples from 3 of the 7 trees. The samples were analyzed at the university's tree ring laboratory. The results showed that all 3 trees were between 210 and 230 years old. The growth rings were consistent with trees that had survived the 1988 fire, showing a brief period of stress followed by recovery. But this was impossible. The fire records clearly indicated total destruction of standing timber in that area. Dr. Bernstein examined the carvings directly. He noted several anomalies. First, the carvings showed no signs of weathering or age. The exposed wood within the carved lines appeared as fresh as if it had been cut recently, despite the trees being over 200 years old. Second, there were no tool marks. Carvings made with knives, chisels, or even modern rotary tools leave distinctive patterns. These carvings had none. The edges were smooth and uniform, almost polished. Third, the depth of the carving was consistent across all 7 trees, exactly 1.2 inches deep. Marquette and Bernstein documented their findings and submitted a report to the Forest Service in August 2018. The report included the historical photographs, the dendrochronology results, and detailed analysis of the carvings. It raised several questions. How could trees documented in 1909 still be standing after a fire that destroyed all timber in the area? Why did the carvings show no aging? What tool or method could produce such uniform marks without leaving any trace evidence? The Forest Service's response, issued in October 2018, acknowledged the report but offered no explanation. A regional archaeologist reviewed the symbol and stated it did not match any known indigenous markings or historical surveying symbols. The report concluded that additional study may be warranted, but provided no timeline or resources for such study. Marquette contacted a colleague at the University of Idaho, an anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Whitlock, who specialized in indigenous cultural practices in the Northern Rockies. Whitlock examined photographs of the symbol and consulted with members of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. None recognized it as part of traditional marking systems. One elder, who requested anonymity, said the symbol looked old in a way that isn't old, and suggested the Forest Service leave it alone. When asked to clarify, the elder declined to elaborate. In November 2018, a small wildfire burned through a section of the Bitterroot Trail, approximately 1 mile south of where the first tree stands. The fire was contained quickly, burning less than 300 acres. A fire crew working the containment line reported finding one of the marked trees within the burn perimeter. The tree's bark was scorched and surrounding vegetation was destroyed, but the tree itself remained standing. The carving was untouched. Marquette attempted to organize a more comprehensive investigation in 2019, reaching out to colleagues in forestry, archaeology, and material science. She proposed using ground-penetrating radar to examine the root systems of the trees and advanced imaging techniques to analyze the carvings at a molecular level. Funding requests were submitted to the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Forest Service. Both were denied. The NSF cited insufficient justification for resource allocation. The Forest Service response was similar, noting that the phenomenon, while interesting, did not pose a management concern. In 2020, during the pandemic, the Bitterroot Trail saw increased use as people sought isolated outdoor spaces. Several hikers photographed the marked trees and posted images on social media. The posts generated brief online interest, with speculation ranging from ancient indigenous markers to elaborate hoaxes. A few users claimed to have visited the trees and reported feeling disoriented or uneasy near them, though these accounts were anecdotal and unverified. A forestry technician named Gregory Sawyer, who worked for the Bitterroot National Forest from 2015 to 2021, later said in an informal interview that Forest Service personnel were advised not to discuss the marked trees with the public. Sawyer said he'd been told the advice came from the regional office in Missoula, but he never received written guidance. When asked why such advice would be given, he said he didn't know. He also mentioned that a few rangers had reported equipment malfunctions, GPS units losing signal, compasses spinning, near the trees. But these incidents were never formally documented. In 2022, Marquette submitted her findings to a peer-reviewed forestry journal. The submission was rejected. The editor's response cited concerns about unverifiable claims and lack of reproducible methodology, despite the inclusion of photographic evidence, dendrochronology data, and historical documentation. Marquette attempted to submit to 2 other journals. Both rejected the manuscript without review. Today, the 7 trees still stand along the Bitterroot Trail. The carvings remain visible, unchanged. The Forest Service maintains no official position on their origin or significance. The trail is open to the public, though it remains remote and seldom traveled. No signs or markers indicate the presence of anything unusual. Hikers who encounter the trees often photograph them and move on, assuming they're looking at modern trail markers or some form of folk art. A few pause longer, studying the symbol, wondering what it means. Some say the trees feel different, though they can't articulate how. Others notice nothing at all. The photographs from 1909, 1954, and 2018 sit in separate archives, taken decades apart, showing the same symbol in the same places. The dendrochronology data confirms the trees are over 200 years old. the fire records confirm the forest burned, and the carvings remain fresh, as if made yesterday, marked by no hand anyone can identify. The forest keeps its secrets. The trees stand as witnesses to something, an event, a message, a warning that no one has yet learned to read. Between 1920 and 1930, 258 people disappeared from the official record in Kendall, Montana, and no one noticed for 70 years. Kendall sits in the Little Belt Mountains of central Montana, approximately 12 miles north of Lewistown. The town was established in 1898 during a gold rush that brought thousands of prospectors into the region. By 1905, Kendall had become a legitimate mining community with two major operations, the Kendall Gold Mining Company and the Barnes King Development Company. The mines were profitable. At its peak, around 1910, Kendall supported a population of nearly 1,800 people. The town had electric lights, running water, a hospital, 3 hotels, several saloons, a school, and a weekly newspaper called the Kendall Chronicle. The gold extracted from Kendall's mines was unusual. It occurred in a complex ore body mixed with arsenic and antimony, requiring sophisticated milling processes. The mines went deep. Some shafts reached over 1,000 feet below the surface. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins and equipment failures were common. But the ore was rich, and the companies paid well enough to keep workers coming. By 1920, production had begun to decline. The richest veins were exhausted, and the remaining ore required more effort to extract and process. Still, both major mining operations remained active. The mills ran multiple shifts. Housing was occupied. The school had students. When the federal census was conducted in January of 1920, enumerators recorded 347 permanent residents within the town limits of Kendall. The census forms from 1920 still exist in the National Archives. They list names, ages, occupations, and places of birth for each resident. The records show miners, mill workers, merchants, and their families. A head count of the submitted forms confirms the total, 347 individuals. 10 years later, in April of 1930, census enumerators returned to Kendall. This time, they recorded 89 residents. The forms list names, ages, and occupations, just as before. But the total population had dropped by 258 people, a decline of 74%. The anomaly went unnoticed for decades. Census data was not easily cross-referenced in the early 20th century, and small mining towns were expected to experience population fluctuations as operations wound down. It wasn't until 1998, during a centennial research project on Montana mining communities, that a historian named Dr. Margaret Ruiz noticed the discrepancy. Ruiz was compiling demographic data for several mining towns and cross-referencing census records with local archives. When she compared the 1920 and 1930 figures for Kendall, the numbers didn't make sense. A decline was expected. Mines were closing across Montana during that period, but the drop was far too steep and too sudden. Ruiz began searching for supporting documentation to explain where the missing 258 people had gone. Death records for Fergus County, where Kendall is located, showed only 11 deaths attributed to Kendall residents between 1920 and 1930. None were from mining accidents or disasters. Most were natural causes or illness. There was no epidemic, no mass casualty event, nothing that would account for a significant loss of population. Ruiz then examined emigration patterns. Mining towns often saw workers leave when jobs dried up, but such departures typically left traces, property sales, forwarding addresses, notices in local newspapers. Ruiz searched through issues of the Kendall Chronicle from 1920 through 1930. The newspaper ceased publication in 1927, but the surviving editions made no mention of mass departures. In fact, several issues from 1925 and 1926 reported stable operations at both mines and noted community events that suggested an active, ongoing population. School records added to the confusion. Enrollment lists from the Kendall School, archived at the Fergus County Courthouse, showed consistent attendance through the 1920s. In the 1920 to 1921 academic year, the school had 62 students enrolled. By 1928 to 1929, enrollment was still at 54. The drop was modest, not catastrophic. Yet the 1930 census recorded only 89 total residents, which would imply fewer than 20 school-age children if typical demographic ratios held. Ruiz attempted to cross-reference individual names from the 1920 census with the 1930 census. She found that only 31 names appeared on both lists. The remaining 58 people recorded in 1930 were new to the town or had not been enumerated in 1920 for unknown reasons. Of the 316 people listed in 1920 but not in 1930, Ruiz could trace the whereabouts of fewer than 40 through death certificates, marriage records, or census entries in other towns. The rest simply vanished from the documentary record. In 2001, Ruiz published her findings in a regional history journal. The article, titled "The Kendall Anomaly, a Case Study in Census Discrepancy," outlined the missing population and called for further research. It generated some interest among historians, but little institutional response. The U.S. Census Bureau, when contacted, stated that census records from that era were known to contain errors and that cross-referencing was difficult due to inconsistent enumeration practices. They noted that no formal complaints or corrections had been filed regarding the Kendall figures at the time. A local historian in Lewistown named Patrick Whalen became interested in Ruiz's work and conducted his own investigation. Whalen had grown up in the area and remembered elderly relatives mentioning Kendall. He interviewed several people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had lived in or near the town. Most had only vague recollections. One woman, whose grandfather had worked at the Barnes King mine in the 1920s, said he'd left Kendall abruptly in 1928 and never talked about it. When asked why, she said her grandfather would only say that the town had gotten too quiet. Whalen also uncovered a set of company records from the Kendall Gold Mining Company, stored in a private collection in Helena. The records included payroll logs from 1920 through 1929. According to the logs, the company employed an average of 120 workers during that period, with only minor fluctuations. The final payroll entry, dated December 1929, listed 114 employees. If these figures were accurate, it would mean the mine alone employed more people than the entire population recorded in the 1930 census. Whalen wrote to the Census Bureau in 2003 requesting a review of the Kendall records. His letter outlined the discrepancies and provided supporting documentation from school records, death certificates, and company payrolls. The Bureau responded 6 months later, acknowledging the letter, but stating that historical census data is considered final and cannot be amended retroactively except in cases of documented clerical error. No clerical error was identified. In 2007, a genealogist named Linda Vasquez attempted to trace the descendants of people listed in the 1920 Kendall census. She focused on 10 families, hoping to find living relatives who might have information about what happened. Vasquez was able to locate descendants of 4 families. In each case, the family history included someone who had lived in Kendall, but the details were sparse. One descendant said his great-grandmother had lived in Kendall until around 1927, before moving to Great Falls. He had no record of why she left or where other family members went. Another descendant, a woman named Evelyn Briggs, said her great-grandfather had been a shift supervisor at the Barnes King mine. According to family stories, he'd quit suddenly in 1928 and moved the family to Billings. Briggs said her grandmother, who had been a child at the time, remembered very little about Kendall except that it was always cold, even in summer. Briggs tried to press her grandmother for more details before she died in the 1990s, but the woman would only say that her father didn't want to stay where people were leaving without saying goodbye. Vasquez's research was never published, but she shared her findings with Whalen, who incorporated them into a presentation at a Montana Historical Society meeting in 2009. The presentation raised questions but offered no answers. Attendees suggested various theories: economic collapse, a flu outbreak that went unrecorded, poor census methodology, or mass migration to other mining regions. None of the theories fully accounted for the lack of documentation. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker named Brian Kepler traveled to Kendall to shoot footage for a project on Montana ghost towns. Kendall, by that time, was nearly abandoned, with only a handful of structures still standing. Kepler interviewed a man named Lawrence Trudeau, who lived on a ranch a few miles from the old town site. Trudeau's family had been in the area since the 1880s. When Kepler asked about Kendall's history, Trudeau mentioned that his grandfather had once said the town emptied out wrong. Kepler asked what that meant. Trudeau said his grandfather never explained it, just that people left Kendall in a way that didn't feel like regular moving. When pressed, Trudeau said he didn't know anything more and didn't want to speculate. Kepler's documentary was never completed. He later said in an interview that he'd lost funding and moved on to other projects. When asked if he'd encountered anything unusual while researching Kendall, he said no, just a lot of missing records and dead ends. Today, Kendall is a near ghost town. A few buildings remain, mostly foundations and collapsed structures. The mines are sealed. The cemetery, located on a hillside east of town, holds fewer than 50 marked graves. There is no historical marker, no interpretive sign, nothing to indicate the town once held hundreds of people. The census records remain in the National Archives, unchanged and unquestioned. 347 people in 1920. 89 in 1930. The math doesn't work, but the documents are official, stamped, and filed. And somewhere in the gap between those two numbers, 258 people vanished from history without death certificates, without forwarding addresses, without anyone filing a formal question until 70 years later. The town is silent now. The wind moves through the empty foundations. And if you search the archives long enough, you'll find their names, faded ink on yellowed paper, listing occupations and birthplaces, preserved in a record that insists they were there. Until 1 decade later, they weren't. There is a place in the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness where sound returns wrong. The Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness covers over 943,000 acres along the Montana-Wyoming border, a vast expanse of alpine peaks, glacial valleys, and granite plateaus. Granite Peak, Montana's highest point at 12,807 feet, rises from this landscape. The wilderness was designated in 1978, combining two separate wilderness areas into one of the largest roadless regions in the contiguous United States. Access is limited to foot and horseback. The terrain is severe. Avalanches are common in winter. Summer brings sudden storms and temperature drops that can turn deadly without warning. Mystic Lake sits at approximately 9,300 feet elevation, roughly 12 miles southwest of the town of Fishtail. The lake is glacially fed, its water a deep turquoise color that shifts with the light. A trail leads to it from the West Rosebud Trailhead, a strenuous 9-mile hike that gains over 2,000 feet. The lake is popular with backpackers who can handle the distance and elevation. Beyond the lake, the terrain becomes more rugged. Fewer people venture into the side canyons and unnamed valleys that branch off from the main trail. One such ravine lies approximately 1 mile northeast of Mystic Lake, cutting into the southeastern face of Mount Hague. The ravine is steep-walled, roughly 200 feet deep and perhaps 300 feet across at its widest point. A seasonal creek runs through it during spring runoff, but dries to a trickle by late summer. The walls are composed of fractured granite and metamorphic rock, dark and striated. Sparse vegetation clings to ledges. The bottom is littered with talus and fallen boulders. There is no official name for the ravine. It appears on topographic maps as a simple contour notation. The anomaly was first documented in August of 2004 by a group of 3 hikers from Bozeman. The group, consisting of Trevor Ashford, Monica Lindberg, and Kyle Doherty, had spent 2 nights camped near Mystic Lake and decided to explore the surrounding area before heading back. They entered the ravine from the southern end, following the dry creek bed upstream. Approximately halfway through, Ashford shouted to test the echo. He later described the experience in an online hiking forum. According to Ashford's post, dated August 23, 2004, he yelled, "Hello," and expected an immediate echo, as would be typical in such terrain. Instead, the sound seemed to vanish. Several seconds passed. Ashford estimated 30 to 35 seconds before an echo returned. He found it strange and shouted again. This time, he counted. The echo came back after approximately 40 seconds. He noted that the returned sound seemed slightly off, as if the tone had shifted, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. Lindberg and Dougherty both confirmed the experience in replies to the forum post. Lindberg wrote that she'd also tested the echo and recorded a delay of around 38 seconds. She added that the echo sounded not quite right, though she couldn't explain what she meant. Dougherty said he'd timed multiple shouts using his watch and consistently recorded delays between 32 and 43 seconds. He noted that typical echoes in mountain terrain return in 1 to 3 seconds, depending on distance to reflecting surfaces. A delay of 30 seconds or more would require sound to travel several miles to a reflective surface and back, which didn't match the confined dimensions of the ravine. The forum post attracted little attention at the time. A few users suggested atmospheric effects or unusual rock formations that might channel sound in unexpected ways. One commenter noted that temperature inversions could create acoustic anomalies. No one offered a definitive explanation. In July of 2007, a geology graduate student named Samuel Kozlowski encountered the same phenomenon while conducting fieldwork in the area. Kozlowski was mapping glacial features near Mystic Lake and had entered the ravine to examine exposed rock layers. Out of curiosity, he tested the echo. He later wrote in his field journal that the delay was approximately 35 seconds, far exceeding expected acoustic return time for observed terrain. Kozlowski recorded several shouts using a handheld digital recorder. When he reviewed the recordings later, he noticed something unusual. The echoes on the recording were clear, but they contained subtle variations. In one instance, Kozlowski had shouted, "testing." The echo returned as "testing," but the syllable emphasis had shifted slightly. In another, he'd shouted a count, 1, 2, 3. The echo repeated the count, but the pauses between numbers were marginally longer than his original shout. Kozlowski noted these observations in his journal, but didn't pursue further investigation. His focus was on geological mapping, not acoustics. In 2009, an acoustic engineer from the University of Montana named Dr. Helena Navarro learned about the ravine through a colleague who had read Ashford's forum post. Navarro specialized in environmental acoustics and had studied sound propagation in various natural settings. She found the reported delays implausible and decided to investigate. On September 12, 2009, Navarro hiked to the ravine with a research assistant named Peter Grunwald. They brought professional audio recording equipment, a laser rangefinder, and GPS units. They documented the ravine's dimensions and took detailed measurements of the surrounding terrain. The ravine walls were roughly 180 feet apart at their widest and approximately 210 feet deep. Based on these measurements, an echo should return in under 2 seconds, accounting for sound traveling to the wall and back at approximately 1,100 feet per second. Navarro and Grunwald conducted a series of tests. They shouted pre-scripted phrases and recorded the results using high-quality microphones. Every test produced the same result. Echoes returned between 30 and 44 seconds after the initial sound. Navarro used the laser rangefinder to measure exact distances to various reflecting surfaces. None were more than 250 feet away. There was no physical explanation for a 30-second delay. More troubling were the variations in the returned sound. Navarro had Grunwald shout a specific phrase, "Acoustic test number 7." The echo returned after 38 seconds, but when Navarro analyzed the waveform, she found discrepancies. The phrase was identical in content, but the pitch varied slightly across certain syllables, and the duration was marginally longer, approximately 0.3 seconds longer than the original. It was subtle, but measurable. Navarro conducted 18 separate tests over 3 hours. In 14 cases, the echoes contained minor variations, shifted emphasis, altered pitch, or extended duration. In 4 cases, the echo was an exact match to the original. Navarro couldn't identify a pattern to explain when variations occurred. She filed a preliminary report with the University of Montana's Department of Physics and Astronomy in October 2009. The report detailed the measurements, the recorded delays, and the waveform analysis. She concluded that the phenomenon defies conventional acoustic theory and recommended further study involving geophysicists and atmospheric scientists. The report was reviewed by the department chair, Dr. Lawrence Bannerman, who responded that while the findings were intriguing, they required replication before allocating additional resources. Navarro returned to the ravine in June of 2010 with expanded equipment, including seismographs to detect subsurface anomalies and temperature sensors to rule out atmospheric inversion. She conducted additional tests over 2 days. The echo delay persisted. The seismographs detected no subsurface voids or cavities that might explain sound channeling. Temperature readings showed normal stratification for the elevation and season. Navarro recorded over 40 echoes during this trip. Approximately 60% contained variations. In one instance, Navarro shouted her own name, Helena Navarro. The echo returned after 41 seconds. When she analyzed the recording, the echo said Helena Navarro, but the surname pronunciation was subtly different, flattened, as if spoken by someone unfamiliar with the name's origin. Navarro played the recording for Grunwald, who agreed the echo sounded off but couldn't specify how. Navarro prepared a full research paper and submitted it to the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in August 2010. The paper included her data, waveform analyses, and environmental measurements. It was rejected in November. The reviewers stated that the findings, while interesting, lacked a plausible theoretical framework and suggested Navarro had failed to account for potential equipment error or environmental variables. Navarro responded that her equipment had been calibrated and tested in multiple controlled environments prior to fieldwork, and that she had documented all environmental variables. The journal declined to reconsider. In 2012, a climber named Julia Weston spent a night camped near the mouth of the ravine during a multi-day traverse of the Beartooth Plateau. She later posted on a mountaineering blog that she'd heard delayed voices coming from the ravine during the night. She wrote that she'd initially thought other campers were nearby, but the voices sounded like echoes of her own words from earlier in the evening when she'd called out to test the acoustics. Weston said the experience unnerved her, and she moved her camp a quarter-mile away. She didn't return to the ravine. In 2015, Navarro made one final trip to the site, this time accompanied by a geophysicist named Dr. Marcus Thorne. Thorne brought ground-penetrating radar to scan for subsurface structures. They spent 3 days in the area. The GPR detected no anomalies, no caves, no voids, no density variations that would affect sound propagation. Thorne later stated in an email to Navarro that the ravine was geologically unremarkable. Navarro conducted her tests again. The delays persisted. The variations in the echoes continued. Thorne witnessed several tests and confirmed the timing. He had no explanation. In a conversation recorded in Navarro's field notes, Thorne said, "It's as if something is listening and then speaking back, rather than sound simply bouncing off rock." Navarro never published her findings. In a 2017 interview with a regional science magazine, she said the academic community had shown no interest and that she'd moved on to other projects. When asked if she believed the phenomenon was real, she said, "The recordings don't lie. Something in that ravine delays sound in a way that shouldn't be possible. Whether it's a natural process we don't understand or something else, I can't say." The ravine remains accessible to anyone willing to hike the trail to Mystic Lake and navigate the unmarked terrain beyond. Some hikers seek it out after reading about it online. Most report experiencing the delay. A few record it. The files circulate on forums dedicated to unusual phenomena, analyzed by amateurs who offer theories ranging from underground water channels to magnetic anomalies. None have been verified. Forest Service rangers in the area are aware of the location, but offer no official comment. One ranger, speaking off the record in 2019, said that a handful of people ask about it each summer. He said he tells them it's just an acoustic quirk, nothing to worry about. When pressed about whether he'd experienced it himself, he said he had once, years ago. He didn't elaborate. The ravine is quiet most of the time. The wind moves through it. The seasonal creek trickles or stays dry depending on the time of year. And if you stand in the right spot and shout into the granite walls, your voice will vanish into the stone, and 35 seconds later, something will shout back. Not quite your voice, not quite an echo, just close enough to make you wonder what's listening. The fire lookout on Granite Peak stopped being used the year someone started answering back. Granite Peak rises 12,799 feet above sea level in the Beartooth Mountains of south-central Montana, the highest point in the state. The peak itself is a technical climb, requiring ropes and experience, but the surrounding wilderness is accessible to those willing to hike the steep, remote trails. The Custer-Gallatin National Forest encompasses this region, a landscape of alpine lakes, granite cirques, and weather that can turn lethal without warning. Snow persists year-round in shadowed couloirs. Lightning storms materialize in minutes. The nearest town, Cook City, sits 23 miles to the southwest, a small community that swells with tourists in summer and nearly empties in winter. The fire lookout was built in 1953 on a subsidiary peak approximately 1 mile northeast of Granite Peak's summit, at an elevation of 11,200 feet. It was a standard 14 by 14-foot cab mounted on a wooden tower, accessed by a steep staircase. The structure was designed to spot wildfires across thousands of square miles of wilderness. Observers staffed the lookout from June through September, living alone for weeks at a time with only a radio for communication. The work was isolated and demanding. Not everyone lasted a full season. By the early 1970s, many fire lookouts across Montana were being decommissioned. Aerial surveillance by small aircraft and eventually satellites made the old towers less necessary. The Granite Peak Lookout was scheduled for closure after the 1976 season. What happened that summer ensured it was never used again. The first observer that year was a forestry student named Dennis Halloran, who arrived in early June. Halloran was 23, experienced in backcountry work, and had spent the previous summer at a different lookout in the Bitterroot Range. His assignment at Granite Peak was supposed to be straightforward: monitor for smoke, report weather conditions, and maintain the equipment. For the first 3 weeks, everything was routine. On June 27, 1976, Halloran radioed the ranger station in Red Lodge to report an unusual occurrence. According to the log kept by the dispatcher, a woman named Carol Jensen, Halloran said he'd been woken at 2:14 a.m. by voices coming through his radio. The voices were not on the standard Forest Service frequency. Halloran said he'd checked and found the chatter was coming through on a frequency that, according to his charts, had been decommissioned by the military years earlier. He couldn't understand the language. It didn't sound like English, Spanish, or any language he recognized. The transmission lasted approximately 4 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Jensen noted the report, but took no immediate action. Radio interference in mountain environments was not uncommon. Atmospheric conditions could cause signals to propagate in unusual ways, sometimes picking up distant broadcasts. Halloran was told to document any further occurrences. The voices returned on July 2nd at 2:14 a.m. This time, Halloran recorded the transmission using a cassette recorder he'd brought for personal use. He radioed the ranger station the next morning and said the pattern was the same: approximately 4 minutes of speech in an unidentified language, then silence. He said the voices sounded like they were reading something, steady, rhythmic, with pauses that suggested list items or coordinates. Jensen asked if Halloran wanted to be relieved early. He declined, saying he was fine, but that the situation was strange. On July 9th, the voices returned again at 2:14 a.m. Halloran made another recording. In his radio report later that day, he mentioned something new. He said that during the transmission, he'd responded over the radio, just a standard call sign and request for identification. The voices had stopped mid-sentence. There was a pause of approximately 15 seconds. Then the transmission resumed, but the tone had changed. Halloran described it as more deliberate, like they were listening. Jensen forwarded Halloran's reports to the district ranger, a man named Robert Gallagher. Gallagher reviewed the situation and decided to replace Halloran with another observer for the remainder of the season. Halloran was reassigned to a ground crew. When asked later why the decision was made, Gallagher said he felt Halloran had been under stress, and that prolonged isolation could affect judgment. Halloran's recordings were filed with the ranger station, but not analyzed. The second observer was a seasonal employee named Linda Kowalczyk, who arrived at the lookout on July 18th. Kowalczyk was 31, had worked multiple seasons in fire lookouts, and was considered reliable and level-headed. She was briefed on Halloran's reports, but told they were likely due to atmospheric interference. Kowalczyk said she wasn't concerned. On July 25th, Kowalczyk radioed the ranger station and confirmed that she'd heard the same transmissions at 2:14 a.m. She said the voices were clear, the language unrecognizable, and the pattern consistent with what Halloran had described. She also said she'd attempted to respond using standard radio protocol and that the transmission had paused before resuming. Kowalczyk said she felt the pause was too precise to be coincidental. Gallagher consulted with the Forest Service's regional communications officer, who suggested the frequency might be bleeding over from a foreign broadcast, possibly Soviet, given the Cold War context of the time. The communications officer said he would look into it, but needed time to research decommissioned military frequencies and potential sources of interference. On August 7th, Kowalczyk radioed again. She said the transmissions had continued every night at 2:14 a.m. without fail. She'd recorded several and noted that the content seemed to be changing. The earlier recordings had sounded like lists or readings. The more recent ones had pauses in different places, as if responding to something. Kowalczyk said she'd stopped attempting to communicate over the radio because the pauses were unnerving. She requested an early departure from the lookout. Gallagher approved her reassignment, and she left the site on August 10th. The third and final observer was a retired firefighter named Eugene Vasquez, who had spent 30 years with the Forest Service and volunteered to finish the season. Vasquez arrived on August 14th. He was aware of the previous reports and skeptical. He brought his own radio equipment to rule out malfunction. On August 21st, Vasquez radioed the ranger station and said the transmissions were real. He'd heard them at 2:14 a.m. and recorded them on his own equipment. He confirmed the language was unidentifiable and the pattern consistent. Vasquez also reported something new. He said that on the night of August 20th, the transmission had included what sounded like a response to his presence. He'd been making notes in his log when the transmission began, and at one point, the voice had paused and said something that, to Vasquez, sounded like a question. He couldn't translate it, but the intonation was unmistakable. Vasquez also mentioned that he'd felt compelled to respond, though he didn't. He said the urge was strong, almost intrusive, and that afterward he'd felt watched. He requested permission to leave the lookout immediately. Gallagher approved, and Vasquez descended on August 23rd. Gallagher filed a report with the Forest Service Regional Office in Missoula on August 30th, 1976. The report summarized the 3 observers' accounts and recommended the lookout be decommissioned and the equipment removed. The report also requested an investigation into the radio transmissions. A copy of the report exists in the Forest Service archives, though sections have been redacted under exemptions related to communication security. In September 1976, a crew was sent to dismantle the lookout's radio equipment. The tower structure was left standing but marked as inactive. No investigation into the transmissions was conducted, at least not publicly. The communications officer, who had been consulted in July, submitted a brief memo stating that the frequency in question had been used by the Air Force for weather reconnaissance in the 1950s and early 1960s, but had been decommissioned in 1964. He noted that no active broadcasts should exist on that frequency. Halloran's and Kowalczyk's recordings were stored at the Red Lodge Ranger Station. Vasquez's recordings were filed separately. In 1983, during an archive consolidation, the recordings were transferred to the regional office in Missoula. In 1997, a researcher requesting access to the recordings was told they could not be located. No further record of their whereabouts exists. In 2002, a backpacker named Stephen Carver spent a night camped near the old lookout site. He later posted on a hiking forum that he'd heard faint voices around 2 a.m., though he couldn't determine the source. He said the voices sounded like they were coming from the direction of the abandoned tower, but when he approached, they stopped. Carver said the experience unnerved him, and he broke camp at first light. In 2009, a group of climbers ascending Granite Peak reported hearing radio static and voices while camped at approximately 11,000 feet, not far from the old lookout. One of the climbers, a woman named Jessica Brennan, later described the voices as rhythmic, like coordinates or instructions, though she couldn't make out specific words. She said the sounds lasted several minutes and then stopped abruptly. The group discussed it the next morning and dismissed it as a distant broadcast, though none of them had radios. In 2014, the Montana Historical Society attempted to compile records on decommissioned fire lookouts for a preservation project. A volunteer researcher named Thomas Aldridge contacted the Forest Service for information on the Granite Peak lookout. He received basic structural data, but no mention of the 1976 incidents. When Aldridge asked specifically about reports of radio anomalies, he was told no such records existed. He later found a reference to Gallagher's August 1976 report in a cross-referenced file, but was unable to obtain the full document. Today, the Granite Peak Lookout Tower stands empty. The cab was removed in 2006 due to structural concerns, but the wooden legs remain, weathered and leaning slightly. Hikers occasionally visit the site, though it's not a common destination. The views are expansive, the silence is profound. And at 2:14 a.m. some nights, that silence breaks. Climbers who've camped nearby in recent years report the same thing: faint voices, unidentifiable language, rhythms that suggest communication. The sounds come from no visible source. They last a few minutes, then they stop. No one has recorded them recently, or if they have, no one has come forward with the recordings. The tower stands, the voices continue, and somewhere in the archives, if you know where to look, there's a file that says 3 experienced observers heard something they couldn't explain, and all 3 asked to leave. The frequency is still dead. The equipment is long gone, but something, it seems, is still transmitting, and maybe after all these years, it's finally learned to listen back. For 15 years, something flew over Billings, Montana on the same night, at the same altitude, and no one could explain what it was or where it went. Billings Logan International Airport sits on a plateau overlooking the Yellowstone River Valley in south-central Montana. The airport was established in 1927 and named after a local aviation pioneer. By the early 1980s, it had become the busiest airport in the state, serving both commercial and private aircraft. The control tower operates 24 hours a day, managing traffic across a wide corridor that includes flights to Denver, Minneapolis, Seattle, and smaller regional destinations. The airspace is generally clear and predictable. Weather can be challenging in winter, but visibility is typically excellent. Controllers at Billings Logan are trained to handle routine traffic and occasional military overflights from nearby Air Force installations. The surrounding landscape is high plains transitioning into mountain ranges. To the south and west, the Beartooth and Absaroka ranges rise into rugged wilderness. To the north, the terrain flattens into prairie and badlands. Flight paths in and out of Billings are well documented, and deviations are rare. Unidentified aircraft are almost unheard of. Civilian pilots file flight plans. Military aircraft coordinate with civilian air traffic control. Everything is tracked, logged, and accounted for, except for one flight that appeared every year on November 8th. The first sighting was documented on November 8, 1982, by an air traffic controller named Warren Kelso. Kelso was working the night shift, monitoring inbound and outbound traffic. At approximately 11:43 p.m., he observed an aircraft on visual approach from the south, traveling due north at what appeared to be 11,000 feet. The aircraft had no transponder signal. It did not appear on radar. Kelso noted the sighting in the shift log and attempted radio contact on multiple frequencies. There was no response. The aircraft was visible for approximately 8 minutes before disappearing from view to the north. Kelso described it as displaying standard navigation lights: red on the left wing, green on the right, white on the tail. The lights were steady, not strobing. He estimated the aircraft's speed at approximately 200 knots based on its rate of travel across his field of vision. He assumed it was a small private plane flying without a transponder, possibly lost or experiencing equipment failure. He filed a report with the Federal Aviation Administration, noting the lack of radar contact and the failure to respond to radio calls. The FAA reviewed the report and found no matching flight plan for that date and time. No aircraft had been reported missing or overdue. No pilots reported equipment malfunctions in the area. The incident was classified as unidentified visual sighting and filed without further action. 1 year later, on November 8, 1983, Kelso was again on duty. At 11:41 p.m., he observed an aircraft matching the same description, traveling due north, 11,000 feet, no transponder, no radar signature. The timing was nearly identical within 2 minutes of the previous year's sighting. Kelso immediately attempted radio contact. Again, there was no response. He alerted his supervisor, a man named Douglas Tolliver, who came to the tower and witnessed the aircraft for the final 3 minutes before it disappeared to the north. Tolliver filed a report with the FAA and contacted the Montana Air National Guard to inquire about possible military flights. The Air Guard confirmed no operations in that airspace on that date. Tolliver also contacted Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls, which oversees much of Montana's military airspace. Malmstrom had no record of flights matching the description. By November 8, 1984, word had spread among the controllers at Billings-Logan. 3 controllers, including Kelso, were on duty that night specifically to observe. At 11:39 p.m., the aircraft appeared. Same flight path, same altitude, same lack of radar signature. This time, multiple controllers attempted radio contact on emergency frequencies, standard aviation frequencies, and military channels. There was no response. The aircraft was visible for 9 minutes before disappearing. The sightings continued annually. Every November 8th, between 11:35 p.m. and 11:50 p.m., an aircraft would appear on a due north heading at 11,000 feet, visible to controllers but absent from radar. The pattern was consistent enough that by 1987, controllers began referring to it informally as the November flight. Some joked about it. Others found it unsettling. All agreed it was unexplained. In 1989, a controller named Brenda Ochoa decided to document the sighting more thoroughly. She brought binoculars to the tower and observed the aircraft for the full duration of its visible passage. She later described it as a twin-engine aircraft, possibly a small commercial or private plane with a conventional configuration. The navigation lights were clearly visible, and the aircraft appeared to be flying straight and level, with no deviation in course or altitude. Ochoa estimated the wingspan at approximately 40 to 50 feet, consistent with aircraft like a Cessna 402 or similar models. She saw no markings or tail numbers, though she acknowledged the distance and lighting conditions made detailed observation difficult. Ochoa filed a detailed report with the FAA, including sketches and estimated specifications. The FAA acknowledged the report but provided no explanation. A representative stated in a written response that without radar confirmation or transponder data, the agency could not initiate a formal investigation. The letter suggested the sightings might be attributable to atmospheric conditions causing visual anomalies, though it did not elaborate on how such conditions would recur annually on the same date. By 1992, the sightings had been occurring for 10 consecutive years. Controllers at Billings-Logan had documented each one. The flight path never varied. The altitude remained constant. The timing was precise, always occurring within a 15-minute window around 11:40 p.m. No crashes had been reported along the projected flight path. No aircraft had been reported missing on any of those dates. The phenomenon defied explanation. In November of 1993, a journalist from the Billings Gazette named Michael Drucker learned about the sightings from a friend who worked at the airport. Drucker interviewed several controllers, including Kelso, Tolliver, and Ochoa. He requested FAA records under the Freedom of Information Act and received copies of the filed reports. Drucker's article, published on November 15, 1993, outlined the history of the sightings and included statements from the controllers. The article generated regional interest but little national attention. The FAA declined to comment beyond reiterating that unconfirmed visual sightings without radar data were not uncommon and did not warrant investigation. In 1995, a retired Air Force pilot named Colonel Vincent Harlan, who lived in Billings, read Drucker's article and became interested in the case. Harlan had flown reconnaissance missions during the Cold War and was familiar with classified aircraft and operations. He reached out to former colleagues and conducted his own inquiry. Harlan later stated in a letter to Drucker that he could find no record of any military program or experimental aircraft that matched the sightings. He noted that the consistent annual recurrence suggested either a highly disciplined operation or something beyond conventional explanation. Harlan also pointed out that the flight path heading due north from Billings would eventually cross into Canada if maintained, though no Canadian authorities had reported corresponding sightings. On November 8, 1996, the aircraft appeared as expected. Kelso, now a senior controller, was on duty. He later said the sighting that year felt no different from previous years, routine in its strangeness. But he noted in his log that the aircraft seemed to be flying slightly lower than usual, possibly 10,800 feet instead of 11,000. The difference was subtle, and Kelso acknowledged it might have been an error in his estimation. November 8, 1997, was the final documented sighting. That night, a controller named Laura Jennings was on duty. Jennings had worked at Billings Logan for 3 years and had witnessed the November flight twice before. At 11:42 p.m., the aircraft appeared. Jennings made the decision to attempt a more direct form of contact. She transmitted a message on the International Emergency Frequency, clearly stating the aircraft's position, heading, and lack of radar signature. She asked for identification and requested the pilot respond immediately. According to Jennings's later account, there was a pause of approximately 10 seconds. Then the aircraft's lights went out. Not gradually, but all at once. The aircraft was no longer visible. Jennings scanned the sky with binoculars, but saw nothing. The aircraft had vanished mid-flight. Jennings immediately notified her supervisor and filed a priority report. The FAA launched a brief inquiry, reviewing radar data and satellite imagery for that night. No radar return was recorded, no heat signature was detected by available satellite systems, no distress signals were received, no wreckage was ever found along the projected flight path. The aircraft did not appear on November 8, 1998, or in any subsequent year. Kelso retired from air traffic control in 2001. In an interview conducted by a regional aviation magazine in 2004, he said the November flight remained the most inexplicable experience of his 30-year career. He had no theory about what it was or why it stopped. When asked if he thought the aircraft had crashed after Jennings's radio call, Kelso said he didn't think so. He said crashes leave evidence, debris, emergency signals, searches. There had been none of that. The aircraft had simply stopped coming. Ochoa, who left air traffic control in 2006 to pursue a different career, later said in a recorded oral history for the Montana Historical Society that the November flight had felt like a routine anomaly until it ended. She said the sudden cessation after the radio contact attempt was more disturbing than the sightings themselves. It suggested awareness, she said, something that could hear and choose to respond by disappearing. In 2012, Drucker, the journalist who had written the original article, attempted to follow up on the story. He contacted the FAA again, requesting any updated records or explanations. The response, dated March 2012, stated that the sightings had been reviewed and attributed to probable misidentification of civilian or military aircraft operating under visual flight rules. The letter noted that no safety violations had occurred and the matter was considered closed. Drucker pointed out that this explanation contradicted the lack of any matching flight plans or military operations. The FAA did not respond to his follow-up inquiry. Today, controllers at Billings Logan International still work the night shift on November 8th. Some are aware of the history, most are not. The tower logs from 1982 through 1997 are archived, accessible through formal requests, though few people ask for them. The flight path, due north at 11,000 feet, is still used by commercial and private aircraft, but none have ever matched the profile of the November flight. And every year, on November 8th, a few people in Billings look up at the sky around 11:40 p.m. just to see if the lights come back. They never do. But the question remains, suspended in the cold November air, was it an aircraft that stopped flying or something that simply decided to stop being seen? The sky over Montana is vast and dark, and some flight paths, it seems, lead to places that don't appear on any map. There are more desks in the photographs than there are in the room. Garnet Ghost Town sits at 60,000 feet elevation in the mountains east of Missoula, Montana, accessible by a winding gravel road that closes each winter under several feet of snow. The town was established in 1895 during a brief gold rush and reached its peak population of around 1,000 residents by 1900. By 1940, the mines had played out, and the last permanent residents left. What remains is one of the best preserved ghost towns in Montana: weathered wooden buildings, abandoned homes, a hotel, a saloon, and a one-room schoolhouse that still contains the original desks where children once studied. The Bureau of Land Management took over management of Garnet in 1970. The site is maintained as a historic preservation, open to visitors from late spring through early fall. In winter, the road becomes impassable, and the town sits buried under snow, visited only by the occasional cross-country skier or snowmobiler willing to make the difficult journey. The schoolhouse is one of the most photographed buildings. Its interior is largely intact: wooden floor, a blackboard on the wall, and rows of small wooden desks arranged as they would have been over a century ago. The anomaly was first noted in 2006 by a BLM seasonal ranger named Philip Garrett, who was cataloging historical photographs for an archive project. Garrett was comparing images of the schoolhouse taken by different visitors over several decades. He noticed something unusual. Many of the photographs showed 23 desks visible in the frame, but Garrett had been inside the schoolhouse dozens of times. He knew there were only 19 desks. Garrett assumed the discrepancy was due to camera angles or visual tricks, perhaps overlapping desks creating the illusion of additional furniture. But when he examined the photographs more carefully, the extra desks were clearly distinct and positioned in spaces where no desks existed during his physical inspections. He brought the matter to his supervisor, a woman named Karen Belmont, who managed the Garnet site. Belmont reviewed the photographs and agreed there was a discrepancy, but suggested it might be due to desks being moved or added over the years by vandals or well-meaning visitors trying to restore the room. Garrett decided to conduct a systematic count. On July 15, 2006, he entered the schoolhouse with a clipboard and counted each desk individually, marking their positions on a hand-drawn map. The total was 19. He photographed the room from multiple angles using a digital camera. When he reviewed the images on his computer that evening, several showed 23 desks. 4 additional desks appeared in the photographs that had not been present during the physical count. Garrett returned to the schoolhouse the next day with Belmont. They counted together 19 desks. Garrett took more photographs, this time with Belmont present, to verify the count before and after. Again, the photographs showed 23 desks. The additional desks appeared in consistent locations: 2 near the back, left corner, 1 along the right wall, and 1 near the front, slightly offset from the others. Belmont suggested the camera might be malfunctioning. Garrett borrowed a different camera from another ranger and repeated the experiment. The results were the same: 19 desks in the room, 23 in the photographs. Over the following weeks, Garrett collected photographs from visitors who had toured Garnet that summer. He asked them to email or mail him any pictures they'd taken of the schoolhouse interior. He received 37 images from 19 different sources. All showed 19 desks. Garrett found this reassuring. The anomaly, he concluded, must have been specific to his camera, or the conditions under which he'd taken the photos. But in October 2006, while reviewing older archived photographs for the BLM's historical records, Garrett found images from 1973, 1981, and 1994 that clearly showed 23 desks. The photographs were taken by different people using different cameras over more than 20 years. Garrett cross-referenced the dates. All 3 photographs had been taken in winter, January 1973, December 1981, and February 1994. Garrett compiled a report and submitted it to Belmont in November 2006. The report included his physical counts, the photographs showing extra desks, and the dates those photographs were taken. Garrett noted that the anomaly seemed to occur only in images taken during the winter months. Belmont reviewed the report and suggested it might be worth contacting a historian or archaeologist who specialized in historical sites. She agreed to forward the report to the Montana Historical Society. In January 2007, Garrett decided to visit the schoolhouse during winter to test his theory. The road to Garnet was closed, so he snowshoed in, a journey of approximately 8 miles from the nearest plowed road. He arrived at the schoolhouse on January 19th. The building was cold and silent, its windows partially obscured by snow. Garrett entered and counted the desks by hand. 19. He took multiple photographs using 2 different cameras, one digital, one film. He also measured and documented the position of each desk. When Garrett developed the film and reviewed the digital images, both sets of photographs showed 23 desks. The 4 extra desks appeared in the same locations he'd identified in the archived images. Garrett noted their positions precisely: 2 in the back left, 1 along the right wall near the 3rd row, and 1 near the front, slightly to the left of center. Garrett returned to Garnet in March 2007, after the snow had begun to melt. He entered the schoolhouse and counted again. 19 desks. He photographed the room. The images showed 19 desks. The anomaly, it seemed, was specific to winter. In April 2007, a historical preservationist named Dr. Laura Edmondson reviewed Garrett's findings at the request of the Montana Historical Society. Edmondson specialized in photographic analysis and had worked on several projects involving historical documentation. She examined the photographs Garrett had provided and confirmed that the images were not digitally altered or manipulated. The additional desks appeared genuine within the photographic frame: consistent lighting, appropriate shadowing, and logical spatial placement. Edmondson suggested several possible explanations. One was that the desks were being moved in and out of the schoolhouse seasonally, perhaps by visitors or caretakers, though this seemed unlikely given the building's remote location and the difficulty of accessing it in winter. Another was that the photographs were capturing furniture that had been removed from the room at some point, but remained visible in certain lighting conditions or through some optical phenomenon. Edmondson acknowledged that neither explanation fully accounted for the consistency of the anomaly across decades and different cameras. Edmondson also reviewed historical records of the Garnet Schoolhouse. According to a school registry from 1908, the schoolhouse had accommodated as many as 32 students during its peak years. The number of desks fluctuated based on enrollment, but records from the 1920s and 30s indicated a typical count of around 20 to 25 desks. By the time the school closed in 1937, only 12 students remained, and it was likely that some desks had been removed or repurposed. Edmondson's report, completed in June 2007, concluded that the photographic anomaly was unexplained but not unprecedented. She noted that historical buildings often display inconsistencies in documentation due to changes over time, poor record keeping, or variations in how spaces were used. She recommended further monitoring, but did not suggest any urgent action. Between 2008 and 2012, Garrett continued to document the schoolhouse. He visited during both summer and winter months, always conducting physical counts and taking photographs. The pattern held. In summer, physical counts and photographs matched, 19 desks. In winter, physical counts showed 19 desks, but photographs showed 23. In 2013, a photographer named Marcus O'Sullivan, who specialized in abandoned places, visited Garnet in February. O'Sullivan was unaware of Garrett's findings. He spent several hours photographing the town, including the schoolhouse interior. When he posted the images online, a viewer commented that the number of desks seemed inconsistent with other photos of the same room. O'Sullivan reviewed his images and counted 23 desks. He contacted the BLM to ask about the schoolhouse's history. Garrett responded to O'Sullivan's inquiry and explained the ongoing documentation of the anomaly. O'Sullivan was intrigued and offered to collaborate. He returned to Garnet in August 2013 and photographed the schoolhouse again. This time, his images showed 19 desks. O'Sullivan compared the summer and winter photographs side by side. The 4 additional desks in the winter images occupied specific, consistent positions. He noted that the desks appeared fully three-dimensional in the photographs, with visible wood grain, shadows, and spatial depth. They were not artifacts or lens flares. O'Sullivan shared his findings on his website and in several photography forums. The posts generated interest, but most commenters dismissed the phenomenon as a hoax or digital manipulation. O'Sullivan provided metadata from his images, demonstrating that they were unedited and taken with different cameras on different dates. The skepticism persisted. In 2015, a doctoral candidate in folklore studies named Jessica Whitmore learned about the schoolhouse anomaly and included it in her dissertation on modern ghost town narratives. Whitmore interviewed Garrett, Belmont, and O'Sullivan. She also reviewed all available photographs and physical documentation. Whitmore's research focused on how anomalies, like the Garnet desks, became embedded in local lore and were interpreted by different communities: historians, paranormal enthusiasts, skeptics, and preservationists. Whitmore noted that the anomaly had a peculiar quality. It was neither dramatic nor easily dismissible. The extra desks didn't appear and disappear. They simply existed in photographs taken during winter months. No witnesses reported seeing the desks physically. No one claimed supernatural experiences in the schoolhouse. The anomaly was quiet, persistent, and fundamentally photographic. Whitmore's dissertation, completed in 2016, concluded that the Garnet schoolhouse represented a category of unexplained phenomena that resisted both easy belief and easy dismissal. She wrote that the consistency of the documentation across decades, cameras, and observers suggested something genuinely anomalous, but the lack of a physical manifestation made it difficult to investigate through conventional means. Today, the Garnet schoolhouse remains, as it has been for decades. The BLM continues to maintain the site, and visitors tour the building during the open season. Rangers conduct periodic counts of the desks. The number is always 19. Photographs taken in summer consistently show 19 desks. Photographs taken in winter by visitors, rangers, and researchers continue to show 23. Garrett retired from the BLM in 2022. In his final report on Garnet, he noted that the anomaly had persisted for at least 16 years under his observation, and likely for decades before that. He wrote that he had no explanation and no recommendation beyond continued documentation. He included a list of coordinates marking the positions of the 4 extra desks as they appeared in winter photographs. In February 2024, A visitor named Alicia Torres snowshoed into Garnet and photographed the schoolhouse. Her images showed 23 desks. Torres posted the photos on social media, unaware of the history. A comment directed her to Garrett's archived reports. Torres reviewed them and returned to Garnet in July. She counted 19 desks and photographed the room again. Her summer images showed 19 desks. Torres later said in an email to the BLM that the experience unsettled her, not because it was frightening, but because it was inexplicable in such a mundane way. She said the desks in the winter photographs looked real, solid, weathered, and entirely ordinary. They didn't glow or shimmer, they simply existed where they should not. The schoolhouse stands now as it always has, quiet and still under the Montana sky. In summer, the room holds 19 desks. In winter, it holds 19 desks. But if you visit in winter and take a photograph, the image may show 23, 4 extra desks, always in the same places, always in winter. No one knows whose children sat there. No one knows if they ever left. There is a well outside Lewistown, Montana, that stopped being a well the day it started speaking back. Lewistown sits in the geographic center of Montana, surrounded by rolling prairie that gives way to isolated mountain ranges in every direction. The town was established in 1879 as a trading post and grew into a regional hub for ranching and agriculture. Water has always been critical in this part of the state. Rainfall is sparse, and groundwater is the primary source for homes, livestock, and crops. Artesian wells, where underground pressure forces water to the surface without pumping, were common in the early 20th century, though many have since been capped or abandoned as municipal water systems expanded. The well in question is located approximately 7 miles northwest of Lewistown, on what was once the Krieger Ranch. The ranch was established in 1892 by a German immigrant family and operated continuously until 1978, when the last of the Kriegers sold the property to a neighboring rancher. The artesian well was drilled in 1937, reaching a depth of 412 feet before striking a pressurized aquifer. The well flowed freely for decades, providing water for the ranch house, livestock, and a small vegetable garden. It was considered one of the most reliable wells in the area. County records indicate the well was sealed on August 9, 1963. The official reason listed in the Fergus County Public Works Dang An is structural failure, with a notation that the well had become unsafe for continued use. A concrete cap was poured over the well opening, and the site was fenced off. No further details were provided in the public record. The events leading to the closure began in late July of 1963. A crew from the Fergus County Water Department had been conducting routine inspections of rural wells as part of a statewide water quality assessment. On July 23rd, 2 inspectors, a man named Vernon Halstead and a woman named Dorothy Merrick, arrived at the Krieger Ranch to test the artesian well. The well was still owned and operated by the Krieger family at that time, specifically by an elderly woman named Ingrid Krieger, who lived alone on the property. Halstead and Merrick's inspection report, filed on July 25, 1963, noted that the well was functioning normally with adequate flow and pressure. Water samples were taken and tested. The results showed no contamination. The well was cleared for continued use. However, a handwritten note at the bottom of the report, signed by Halstead, read, "Advised property owner to contact county office regarding unusual acoustic phenomenon. Further evaluation recommended." According to a follow-up memo dated July 30, 1963, Ingrid Krieger had contacted the county office and reported that workers had heard voices coming from the well. The memo, written by the county water supervisor, a man named Gerald Stumpf, stated that Krieger was elderly and possibly confused, but that a follow-up inspection would be scheduled to maintain good relations with rural constituents. On August 2, 1963, Stumpf and another county employee, a technician named Lloyd Bakken, visited the Krieger Ranch. Stumpf's official report from that visit, filed August 5th, confirmed the acoustic anomaly. The report stated, "Upon arrival, property owner demonstrated phenomenon. Subject spoke into well opening. After delay of approximately 3 to 4 seconds, words were repeated back. Repetition was not an echo. Voice was distinct from subject's voice. Phenomenon repeated multiple times with consistent results. Recommend immediate closure of well pending further evaluation." Stumpf and Bakken both provided supplementary statements that were attached to the report. Bakken's statement described the experience in more detail. He wrote that he had leaned over the well opening and called down, "Can you hear me?" After a brief pause, he heard the same words repeated back, but the voice was different, lower in pitch and flatter in tone. He tested it again by saying his name, Lloyd Bakken. The response came back as Lloyd Bakken, but the pronunciation was slightly off, as if spoken by someone unfamiliar with the name. Bakken noted that there was no echo preceding or following the voice. It was a single, clear repetition. Stumpf's statement was more reserved. He confirmed that he had witnessed the phenomenon multiple times and that it was consistent and repeatable. He added that the delay between the spoken words and the response varied slightly, between 3 and 5 seconds, but was generally predictable. He noted that the well was over 400 feet deep and that normal acoustic properties would not produce the effect they observed. He recommended the well be sealed immediately as a precautionary measure. On August 6th, a county engineer named Raymond Tolliver was sent to inspect the well's structural integrity. Tolliver's report, filed August 7th, stated that the well casing appeared sound, with no visible cracks or damage. He conducted a visual inspection using a flashlight and mirror system and reported that the shaft was cleared down to approximately 80 feet, at which point visibility was lost due to darkness and the well's depth. Tolliver noted that the well was still flowing and that water quality remained normal based on field tests. However, he also confirmed the acoustic anomaly. In his report, he wrote, "Spoke into well at 14:32 hours, said, 'This is Raymond Tolliver conducting inspection.' Response came at approximately 14:32:04. Voice repeated statement in different tone. No explanation for phenomenon. Recommend closure." The decision to seal the well was made on August 8th by the Fergus County Board of Commissioners. The meeting minutes from that date include a brief discussion of the Krieger well. One commissioner, whose name is redacted in available records, is quoted as saying, "We can't have a well that talks back to people. Seal it and move on." Another commissioner expressed concern about the cost of sealing a functional well, but the motion to close the well passed unanimously. The official reason given was structural failure, though no structural failure had been documented. A concrete contractor from Lewistown, a man named Eugene Vasquez, was hired to seal the well. Vasquez and his crew poured the concrete cap on August 9, 1963. In a later conversation with a local reporter in 1998, Vasquez said he remembered the job clearly. He said the crew had been told it was a routine well closure, but when they arrived, they were informed by county officials not to speak into the well or linger near the opening. Vasquez said he'd been curious and had leaned over the edge before the concrete was poured. He called down, "Hello?" After a few seconds, he heard "hello" repeated back, but in a voice that sounded like a child's. Vasquez said it unsettled him, and he told his crew to work quickly. The concrete was poured, and the site was fenced. Ingrid Krieger died in 1967. Her property was sold in 1978. The new owner, a rancher named Mitchell Osgood, later said he'd been told the sealed well was cursed, but dismissed it as rural superstition. Osgood never attempted to reopen the well. He drilled a new well on a different part of the property in 1981. In 1997, a graduate student in geology from Montana State University named Angela Ferraro attempted to research the sealed well as part of a thesis on aquifer systems in central Montana. Ferraro reviewed county records and discovered the unusual closure in 1963. She contacted the Fergus County Water Department and requested access to the original inspection reports. She received heavily redacted versions of the documents with most of the supplementary statements removed. The reason for the redactions was listed as privacy protection. Ferraro visited the site in June 1998. The concrete cap was still in place, weathered but intact. The fence around the well was partially collapsed. Ferraro photographed the site and attempted to use ground-penetrating radar to examine the well shaft, but the equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. She later wrote in her thesis that the site presented unusual electromagnetic interference but could not determine the cause. Ferraro's thesis was completed in 2000, but the section on the Krieger well was brief and inconclusive. Her advisor suggested she focus on more quantifiable data. In 2004, a journalist named Marcus Oleska, who wrote for a regional magazine, learned about the well while researching abandoned infrastructure in Montana. Oleska obtained unredacted copies of some of the 1963 reports through a Freedom of Information Act request. He interviewed several people, including Eugene Vasquez, who was still living in Lewistown at the time. Oleska's article, published in October 2004, outlined the history of the well and included excerpts from the inspection reports. The article generated some local interest, but no official response from Fergus County. Oleska also spoke with two residents of Lewistown who claimed to have visited the well in the 1980s. One, a woman named Patricia Lundgren, said she and a group of friends had gone to the site at night as teenagers. They'd removed part of the fence and leaned close to the concrete cap, shouting questions into the cracks around the edges. Lundgren said they heard faint responses, not clear words, but sounds that seemed deliberate. She said the experience frightened them, and they left quickly. The other resident, a man named Dale Whitford, said he'd visited the site in 1987 out of curiosity. He claimed he heard nothing unusual, but he noted that he'd felt watched while standing near the cap. Both accounts were anecdotal and unverified. In 2012, a team of paranormal investigators requested permission from the current property owner to examine the well. The owner, who wished to remain anonymous, declined. The team attempted to access the site without permission and were escorted off the property by local law enforcement. No charges were filed. Today, the well remains sealed. The concrete cap shows no signs of deterioration or structural failure. The site is on private property and is not accessible to the public. The current owner reportedly avoids the area and has stated to neighbors that nothing good comes from digging up the past. Locals in Lewistown are generally reluctant to discuss the well. A few older residents remember the closure in 1963, but most declined to elaborate. One man, who asked not to be named, said his father had worked for the county water department and had been present during one of the inspections. The man said his father never talked about it in detail, but once mentioned that the well knew things it shouldn't. When pressed, the man said his father refused to explain. The Fergus County Dang An contain the original reports, though access requires formal requests, and many sections remain redacted. The official position of the county, stated in response to inquiries, is that the well was sealed due to structural concerns and that no further action is planned. The concrete cap remains. The fence, though deteriorated, still marks the boundary. And beneath 412 feet of earth and stone and silence, the aquifer still flows, cold and pressurized, moving through darkness that no one has seen since 1963. And if you stand close enough, on certain nights when the wind is still, some say you can hear it. Not the water, but something else. A faint sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like words being shaped in the absence of air. Not an echo, something answering. The border between Montana and Idaho moved in 1998, and no one will say who moved it or why. Lost Trail Pass sits at 7,100 feet elevation on the Continental Divide, marking the boundary between Montana's Bitterroot Valley and Idaho's Salmon River country. The pass has been a crossing point for thousands of years. The Nez Perce people used it as a trade route. Lewis and Clark crossed it in September 1805, nearly starving in early snow. By the late 1800s, the pass had become a recognized transit corridor, and when Montana and Idaho finalized their border in 1889, surveyors placed boundary markers along the ridgeline at precise intervals. The markers are concrete monuments, approximately 3 feet tall, embedded in bedrock where possible. Each bears the designation MT on one side and ID on the other, along with a stamped number indicating its position in the survey sequence. The original markers were placed using the best available technology of the time: transits, chains, and celestial observations. The border they defined was legally binding and has remained unchanged in official records for over a century. The terrain near Lost Trail Pass is rugged. Dense forest covers the lower slopes, giving way to alpine meadows and exposed granite near the ridgeline. Weather is severe. Snow can fall any month of the year. Winters bury the pass under 10 feet or more. The nearest towns, Sula, Montana, and Gibbonsville, Idaho, are small and isolated. The pass itself is crossed by U.S. Highway 93, which follows roughly the same route Lewis and Clark took, though the modern road is paved and maintained year-round. The anomaly was discovered in late August of 1998 by a U.S. Forest Service surveyor named Kevin Rourke. Rourke was conducting a routine GPS survey of Forest Service boundaries in the Bitterroot National Forest, which straddles the Montana-Idaho border. As part of his work, he was cross-referencing the current GPS coordinates of state boundary markers with their documented positions from the original 1889 survey and subsequent verifications conducted in 1934 and 1972. On August 27, 1998, Rourke located boundary marker number 47, approximately 1.3 miles north of Lost Trail Pass, along the ridgeline. He recorded its GPS coordinates and immediately noticed a discrepancy. According to his equipment, the marker was 14 feet south of where it should have been based on all previous surveys. Rourke assumed his GPS unit was malfunctioning. He marked the location and moved on to the next marker, number 48, located half a mile to the north. Marker 48 showed the same discrepancy, 14 feet south of its documented position. Rourke checked his equipment. It was functioning normally. He returned to marker 47 and took additional readings. The results were consistent. The marker had moved, or more precisely, it had been moved. What troubled Rourke was not just the displacement, but the condition of the markers. Both monuments appeared to have been recently reset. The concrete around their bases was fresh, not weathered. The stamped numbers and state designations were clear and newly cut, as if the markers had been replaced entirely. Yet the numbers matched the original survey sequence from 1889. Rourke photographed both markers and filed a report with his supervisor on August 31st. The report was forwarded to the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, which oversees state boundaries. A surveyor from the state office, a woman named Patricia Orozco, was dispatched to verify Rourke's findings. Orozco arrived at the site on September 9, 1998, accompanied by a geodetic specialist from the U.S. Geological Survey named Dr. Harold Lindstrom. They brought high-precision GPS equipment capable of sub-centimeter accuracy. Orozco and Lindstrom surveyed 6 boundary markers in the area, numbers 45 through 50. All 6 had been displaced by exactly 14 feet to the south. All 6 showed evidence of recent resetting, fresh concrete, new anchor bolts, and clean engraving. The work was professional, consistent with modern surveying standards, but there was no record of any authorized survey work in the area. Neither Montana nor Idaho had contracted for boundary maintenance. No federal agency had scheduled work. No permits had been issued. Orozco's report, filed September 15, 1998, described the findings in technical detail. She noted that the displacement was uniform across all markers, suggesting a systematic resurvey rather than random vandalism or natural movement. She also noted something more disturbing. The new positions of the markers, according to historical topographic maps and geological surveys, corresponded to locations that had been submerged under a seasonal meltwater lake in 1889, when the original border was established. Dr. Lindstrom's supplementary report, filed the same day, confirmed Orozco's findings and added geological context. He noted that the ridgeline near Lost Trail Pass had been shaped by glacial activity and that meltwater lakes were common in the area during the late 1800s before climate patterns shifted. Historical maps from 1889 showed a shallow lake, approximately 200 feet across, in the exact area where the markers now stood. The original surveyors would have placed the markers on dry ground along the ridgeline above the lake. The current markers, displaced 14 feet south, were positioned where the lake's northern shore would have been. Lindstrom raised a troubling question in his report. Why would someone reset the markers in positions that were historically underwater? And how would they know the precise locations of the lake's shoreline from over a century ago, information that existed only in archived topographic surveys and geological records? Both Montana and Idaho launched inquiries. The Montana Department of Natural Resources contacted all licensed surveyors in the state, asking if anyone had conducted work near Lost Trail Pass. All responses were negative. Idaho's Department of Lands conducted a similar inquiry with identical results. The U.S. Forest Service reviewed its records and found no authorized boundary work. The Bureau of Land Management, which manages some parcels near the border, reported no activity. In October 1998, a joint team from Montana and Idaho returned to the site to examine the markers more closely. The team included Orozco, a boundary specialist from Idaho named Gerald Kowalski, and a forensic materials analyst from Montana State University named Dr. Elaine Vasquez. Dr. Vasquez took samples of the concrete used in the marker bases and had them analyzed. The results showed that the concrete was a modern Portland cement mix, likely poured within the previous 6 months. The aggregate in the mix included local stone, suggesting the concrete had been mixed on-site or nearby. Dr. Vasquez also examined the engraving on the markers. The letters and numbers had been cut using a modern rotary tool, not the hand-chiseling methods used in the 1800s. The depth and precision of the cuts were consistent with professional masonry work. Whoever had reset the markers had done so with expertise and resources. The joint team also discovered something else. Near marker 47, partially hidden by vegetation, they found a small brass survey cap embedded in the ground. The cap bore the inscription USGS 1998, along with a coordinate reference. Brass caps are standard markers used by the U.S. Geological Survey to establish precise geodetic control points. But when the team contacted the USGS office in Denver, they were told that no survey work had been authorized or conducted in that area in 1998. The brass cap did not appear in any USGS database. Kowalski attempted to trace the origin of the brass cap. He contacted manufacturers of survey equipment and provided photographs of the cap's markings. One manufacturer, based in Colorado, confirmed that the cap's design was consistent with their products, but they had no record of sales to government agencies or private surveyors working near Lost Trail Pass in 1998. The brass cap's origin remained unknown. By November 1998, the investigation had stalled. Both Montana and Idaho concluded that the markers had been moved by an unknown party using professional equipment and techniques. The motive was unclear. The cost of such work, transporting equipment to a remote high-elevation site and resetting 6 concrete monuments with precision, would have been substantial. Yet there was no apparent benefit. The displaced markers did not favor one state over the other. The shift was uniform and deliberate, but its purpose was incomprehensible. In December 1998, Montana and Idaho jointly decided to reset the markers to their original, legally defined positions. A contracted survey crew completed the work in July 1999 using GPS and historical survey data to ensure accuracy. The displaced markers were removed and replaced with new monuments anchored in their correct locations. The old markers were stored in a state facility in Missoula. In 2003, a journalist named Thomas Aldridge, writing for a regional history magazine, learned about the incident and requested access to the investigation files. He received heavily redacted documents from both states. Most of the technical data was intact, but several sections, particularly those related to the brass survey cap and the forensic analysis of the concrete, were blacked out. When Aldridge asked why, he was told the redactions were made to protect ongoing investigative processes, though no investigation appeared to be active. Aldridge interviewed Rourke, who had since retired from the Forest Service. Rourke said he'd never received a satisfactory explanation. He noted that the quality of the work suggested government resources, yet no government agency would claim responsibility. When Aldridge asked if Rourke thought the displacement might have been a mistake, Rourke said no. The precision was too exact. 14 feet, every marker. Someone had measured carefully. Aldridge also spoke with Dr. Lindstrom, who had left the USGS and was working as a private consultant. Lindstrom said the case remained one of the strangest he'd encountered in his career. He emphasized the historical lake detail, that the markers had been moved to positions that corresponded to an 1889 shoreline. He said it suggested someone had access to very old topographic data and had deliberately chosen those locations. When Aldridge asked why someone would do that, Lindstrom said he didn't know, but he found it deeply unsettling. Aldridge's article was published in 2004. It generated some interest in local history circles, but no official response from Montana or Idaho. The case was considered closed. The markers were back in their correct positions. The displaced monuments were in storage, rarely mentioned. In 2016, a hiker named Derek Paulson reported finding a metal survey stake near Lost Trail Pass, about 200 feet west of where marker 47 had been displaced. The stake bore no identifying marks, but it was driven deep into rocky ground and appeared to be part of a survey grid. Paulson reported it to the Forest Service, which sent a ranger to investigate. The ranger confirmed the stake's presence, but found no others in the area. The stake was removed and filed as unexplained debris. Today, the boundary markers along Lost Trail Pass stand in their legally defined positions, verified by GPS, and consistent with all historical surveys. The ridgeline is quiet. Hikers pass through occasionally. The highway carries traffic between Montana and Idaho. Everything is as it should be. But in a storage facility in Missoula, 6 concrete monuments sit in a corner, their surfaces weathered now, their engravings still sharp. Monuments that once marked a border 14 feet south of where the border should be. Monuments that were placed with precision and care in positions that, over a century ago, lay beneath cold water. No one knows who moved them, no one knows why, and no one knows what they were marking, if not the border between 2 states. Only that someone measured carefully. Someone knew where the water had been, and someone for reasons that remain silent, wanted those markers exactly where they were found. 14 feet south, in places that shouldn't have mattered, but did. "11 people who had never met described the same dream about a building that no longer exists. Fort Missoula sits on the western edge of Missoula, Montana, where the valley begins its gradual rise toward the Bitterroot Mountains. The fort was established in 1877 as a military post during the conflicts with the Nez Perce people. Over the following decades, it served various functions: cavalry training, civilian conservation corps headquarters, and most notably, a detention center during World War II. From 1941 to 1944, the fort held Italian prisoners of war and, later, Japanese-American citizens relocated under Executive Order 9066. The conditions were harsh, the winters severe, and the isolation profound. By the early 1990s, most of the original fort structures had been demolished or repurposed. In 1995, the Fort Missoula Historical Museum was established on the grounds, preserving what remained and offering guided tours of the site's complex history. The museum includes several original buildings, interpretive displays, and archives documenting the fort's use during wartime. One structure that no longer stands is Barracks Building 7, which housed detainees during the winters of 1942 and 1943. It was demolished in 1947 due to structural deterioration and never rebuilt. Photographs of the building exist in the museum's collection, showing a long, single-story wooden structure with a peaked roof and rows of small windows. The pattern began in the summer of 2001. A woman named Rebecca Kowalski, visiting from Wisconsin, toured the museum on June 14th. She spent approximately 2 hours on site, viewing exhibits and walking the grounds. That night, staying at a hotel in downtown Missoula, she experienced what she later described as an unusually vivid dream. In the dream, she was walking through deep snow at night, moving toward a cluster of lights in the distance. The lights were warm, yellow, and seemed to come from windows. Behind her, she heard voices, multiple voices, speaking in unison, counting backward from 47. She couldn't see the speakers. She kept walking toward the lights, but never got closer. The dream ended when the counting reached 0. Kowalski thought little of it at the time. She continued her vacation and returned home. She didn't mention the dream to anyone at the museum. In August 2001, a retired school teacher named Martin Vasquez toured the museum with his wife. Vasquez was from New Mexico and had no prior connection to Montana or Fort Missoula. 2 nights after his visit, while staying at a bed and breakfast in Lolo, he had a dream. He was walking through snow in darkness, following distant lights that never grew closer. Behind him, voices counted backward from 47. He woke before the counting finished. Vasquez mentioned the dream to his wife, who had not experienced anything similar. He found it odd, but didn't pursue it further. The third reported instance came in October 2001. A graduate student named Angela Marquette visited the museum as part of research for a thesis on wartime internment sites. She toured the facility alone, taking notes and photographs. That night in her apartment in Missoula, she had the dream: snow, distant lights, voices counting backward from 47. Marquette was disturbed by the vividness of the experience and mentioned it to a museum staff member during a follow-up visit 2 weeks later. The staff member, a curator named Douglas Finch, made a note of it but took no action. By March 2002, Finch had received reports of similar dreams from 2 additional visitors. One was a man named Gregory Sawyer, an engineer from Seattle who had toured the museum in January. The other was a woman named Patricia Orozco, a journalist from Billings who had visited in February. Both described the same elements: walking through snow, distant lights, voices counting backward from 47. Neither had spoken to the other or to previous visitors. Finch began documenting the reports in a log. Between April 2002 and November 2004, 6 more visitors reported identical dreams. The individuals came from different states, visited on different dates, and had no contact with one another. All described the same sequence: snow, lights, countdown. Several mentioned additional details. The snow was deep, above the knees. The air was extremely cold. The lights came from windows in a long, low building. The voices were calm, methodical, and spoke in English. The counting never went below 0. Each dreamer woke, or the dream ended before the final number. Finch compiled the reports and presented them to the museum's director, a historian named Dr. Lorraine Belmont, in December 2004. Belmont reviewed the documentation and found it unusual, but not unprecedented. She noted that historical sites sometimes evoke strong emotional responses in visitors, and vivid dreams were not uncommon. However, the consistency of the reports, 11 unrelated individuals describing identical experiences, was notable. Belmont suggested Finch contact the visitors to gather more detailed accounts. Finch reached out to the 11 visitors via email or phone. 9 responded and agreed to provide written statements. The statements were remarkably consistent. All described the same environmental conditions: nighttime, heavy snowfall, extreme cold. All described the same audio phenomenon: multiple voices counting backward from 47. Several noted that the voices sounded distant but clear, as if coming from inside the snow itself. 2 visitors mentioned that they felt compelled to keep walking toward the lights, even though they knew they would never reach them. One visitor, Patricia Orozco, provided additional detail. She said that in her dream, she briefly turned around to see who was counting. She saw nothing but snow and darkness, but she noticed footprints behind her, multiple sets, as if many people had been walking in the same direction. She also said that as the counting continued, she began to recognize architectural details of the building ahead. It was long and low, with a peaked roof and evenly spaced windows. She described it in her statement as institutional, like a barracks or detention hall. When Finch showed Orozco archival photographs of the demolished Barracks Building 7, she confirmed that the structure in her dream matched the building in the photos. She had not seen these photographs during her museum visit. She had no prior knowledge of the building's existence or appearance. Finch interviewed the other visitors with the same result. 5 of the 9 who provided detailed statements were able to describe architectural features of Barracks Building 7 that matched historical photographs. None had seen the photographs before their dreams. The building's appearance was not prominently featured in the museum's exhibits. The photographs existed primarily in archival storage, accessible only by request. In January 2005, Finch contacted a psychologist at the University of Montana named Dr. Helena Trudeau, who specialized in memory and perception. Finch explained the situation and provided copies of the visitor statements. Dr. Trudeau reviewed the material and noted that while shared dreams or similar dream experiences occasionally occur in group settings, the individuals in this case had not been in contact with one another. She suggested that the museum environment might contain subtle cues, images, sounds, or narratives that predisposed visitors to similar dream content. However, she acknowledged that the architectural specificity was difficult to explain through conventional psychological mechanisms. Dr. Trudeau visited the museum in February 2005 to assess the site. She toured the exhibits, reviewed the materials presented to visitors, and examined the archival photographs of Barracks Building 7. She found no obvious cues that would account for the shared dream content. The exhibits focused primarily on the fort's military history and the broader context of wartime internment, not on specific buildings. Photographs of Barracks Building 7 were not displayed in public areas. Dr. Trudeau concluded in her report that the phenomenon was unusual but not definitively explicable through known psychological processes. She recommended continued documentation but offered no further analysis. In March 2005, Finch discovered an additional detail in the museum archives. While researching the history of Barracks Building 7, he found a maintenance log from 1943. The log noted that the building's heating system had failed multiple times during the winter, leaving detainees without adequate warmth for extended periods. One entry, dated February 19, 1943, recorded that 47 detainees had been temporarily relocated to other facilities due to unsafe conditions in the barracks. The entry did not specify where they were relocated or for how long. Finch brought this information to Belmont's attention. Belmont reviewed the log and noted the coincidence of the number 47, but cautioned against drawing conclusions. She pointed out that the number could be coincidental and that there was no evidence linking the maintenance issue to the dream reports. Finch agreed, but felt the detail was worth documenting. No further dream reports were filed after November 2004. Finch continued to monitor visitor feedback through 2007 when he left his position at the museum. His successor was briefed on the phenomenon but received no additional reports. The 11 documented cases remain on file in the museum's archives, accessible to researchers by request. In 2012, a filmmaker named Brian Kepler learned about the dream reports while researching a documentary on Montana historical sites. Kepler contacted several of the original visitors, including Orozco and Vasquez. Both confirmed their experiences and reiterated that the dreams had been unusually vivid and disturbing. Vasquez mentioned that he'd never had a similar dream before or since. Orozco said she'd avoided returning to Fort Missoula because the memory of the dream unsettled her. Kepler requested access to the museum's archives and reviewed Finch's documentation. He also interviewed Dr. Trudeau, who maintained that the phenomenon remained unexplained. Kepler's documentary was never completed, though he included a brief segment on Fort Missoula in a later project. The dream reports were mentioned but not explored in depth. In 2018, a visitor named Thomas Aldridge toured the museum and later submitted a statement describing a dream identical to the 11 previous reports. Aldridge had no knowledge of the earlier cases. Museum staff documented his report but did not publicize it. The total number of confirmed cases is now 12. Today, Fort Missoula Historical Museum continues to operate, offering tours and educational programs. The site of Barracks Building 7 is now an empty field, marked only by a small interpretive sign noting its former location. Visitors walk past it regularly. Most are unaware of its history or the dreams associated with it. The museum's archives contain the 12 statements, the archival photographs, and Finch's original log. The documents are available to researchers but rarely requested. The phenomenon has not been studied further. No scientific explanation has been proposed. The dreams, as far as is known, have not recurred beyond the 12 documented cases. But the pattern remains. 11 people, later 12, who never met, described walking through snow toward a building that was torn down in 1947. They heard voices counting backward from 47. They saw architectural details they shouldn't have known. And they all woke before the counting reached 0. The barracks are gone. The field is empty, and the snow in the dreams continues to fall, deep and cold, under a sky that no one can see, toward lights that never arrive. 47, 46, 45. The counting continues, in sleep, in silence, in a place that isn't there anymore, but somewhere, in the space between memory and forgetting, it still stands, and the voices still count. There is a place in the Missouri River where the water moves in a direction rivers shouldn't go. The Missouri River cuts through central Montana for over 500 miles, flowing generally northeast from its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains, toward its confluence with the Mississippi River far to the east. Near Great Falls, the river descends through a series of dramatic waterfalls, 5 major cascades that drop a total of more than 500 feet over 10 miles. The falls were documented by Lewis and Clark in 1805 during their westward expedition. The explorers spent nearly a month portaging around them, a grueling task that tested the limits of the Corps of Discovery. By the early 20th century, the falls had been harnessed for hydroelectric power. Dams now control the flow, and the landscape has changed, but the river remains powerful and unpredictable. The section in question lies approximately 3 miles downstream from Rainbow Dam, one of 5 dams that form a cascade of reservoirs through the Great Falls area. The river here is wide and relatively calm, flowing through a landscape of cottonwood groves and eroded bluffs. Water depth averages between 8 and 15 feet. The current is steady, but not dangerous. Recreational boating and fishing are common. The Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department monitors the area regularly. It's considered safe, well-documented, and unremarkable, except for a 30-foot diameter section where the current moves in a perfect circle. The anomaly was first noted in May of 2007 by a fisherman named Leonard Bakken, who had been fishing the area for over 20 years. Bakken was drifting downstream in a small aluminum boat when he noticed debris, a plastic bottle, and a section of driftwood, circling in place near the western bank. The debris moved slowly, tracing a clockwise path in what appeared to be a whirlpool, though the surrounding water showed no signs of turbulence. Bakken watched for several minutes. The debris completed multiple rotations without deviation. When Bakken threw a small stick into the area, it was caught by the current and began circling as well. Bakken reported the observation to a friend who worked for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The friend, a biologist named Stephen Carver, visited the site on May 19, 2007. Carver confirmed the phenomenon. He observed floating debris circling in a consistent 30-foot diameter pattern. The current moved at an estimated half a knot, slow but steady. Carver noted that the surrounding river flow was normal and that the circular current appeared isolated to a specific area. He took GPS coordinates and filed a brief report with his department, noting it as a localized eddy or vortex, likely caused by submerged obstruction or bottom irregularity. Over the following months, Carver returned to the site several times. The circular current persisted. It did not vary in size or speed. Carver attempted to measure the depth using a weighted line and found the bottom at approximately 12 feet, consistent with hydrological charts for that section of the river. He saw no evidence of submerged obstructions, large rocks, or debris that would explain the current's behavior. In August 2007, Carver mentioned the phenomenon to a colleague at the University of Montana, a hydrologist named Dr. Patricia Lindstrom. Lindstrom specialized in river dynamics and sediment transport. She visited the site on August 23rd with Carver and a graduate student named Marcus Oleska. They brought sonar equipment to examine the riverbed more closely. The sonar scan showed a flat, unremarkable bottom composed of silt and gravel. No anomalies were detected, no submerged structures, no unusual topography. The depth reading was consistent at 12 feet. Lindstrom was puzzled. She noted in her field journal that circular currents, while not impossible, typically occur in specific conditions, behind obstructions, near confluences, or in areas with significant depth variation. None of those conditions were present. Lindstrom conducted a simple test. She released a biodegradable dye into the circular current and tracked its movement using a stopwatch and camera. The dye traced a perfect circle, completing one full rotation in approximately 90 seconds. The pattern repeated without variation for over 30 minutes before Lindstrom ended the observation. She noted that fish, primarily smallmouth bass and northern pike, common in that section of the river, actively avoided the area. Schools of fish would approach, then veer away before entering the circular current. Lindstrom filed a report with the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation in September 2007. The report described the phenomenon, included sonar data and photographs, and recommended further study. The department acknowledged the report but took no immediate action. Lindstrom submitted a grant proposal to the National Science Foundation to fund a more detailed investigation. The proposal was rejected in December 2007. The reviewers stated that the phenomenon, while interesting, did not present a significant hazard or scientific priority. Between 2008 and 2010, Carver continued to monitor the site during routine patrols. The circular current remained unchanged. Carver noted in his personal logs that debris entering the current never seemed to leave. Sticks, leaves, and floating vegetation would circle for hours, sometimes days, before disappearing. Carver assumed the material eventually sank or was pulled under, though he never observed it happening. In March 2011, a team from Montana Tech, a university in Butte, became interested in the phenomenon. A professor of environmental engineering named Dr. Harold Vasquez had read Lindstrom's report and decided to conduct an independent study. Vasquez and two students, Angela Marquette and Derek Paulson, visited the site on March 14, 2011. They brought a research-grade GPS buoy equipped with depth sensors, temperature monitors, and a satellite transmitter. The buoy was released into the circular current at 10:37 a.m. It immediately began circling, transmitting data every 30 seconds. The initial readings showed a depth of 12 feet, a water temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and a current speed of 0.4 knots. The team observed for 3 hours. The buoy completed 72 rotations, never deviating from the 30-foot diameter circle. Vasquez left the buoy in place, expecting it to either break free of the current or eventually sink. The buoy continued transmitting. Over the following 6 days, the data remained consistent. Depth at 12 feet, circular motion maintained, temperature stable. On March 20th, at approximately 2:15 p.m., the depth reading suddenly changed. The buoy transmitted a depth of 53 feet. 30 seconds later, the depth reading was 94 feet. 30 seconds after that, 190 feet. The buoy's final transmission, received at 2:16 and 30 seconds p.m. on March 20th, showed a depth of 190 feet, a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and a position still within the circular current's coordinates. The signal then went dead. No further transmissions were received. Vasquez and his team returned to the site on March 21st. They conducted multiple sonar scans of the area. The depth readings showed 12 feet, consistent with previous measurements. There was no evidence of a deeper channel, pit, or anomaly. The buoy was not visible on sonar. Vasquez contacted the satellite service provider to verify the data. The provider confirmed that the transmissions had been received and that the depth readings, while unusual, were within the equipment's operational parameters. The buoy had not malfunctioned. It had transmitted accurate data until it stopped. Vasquez filed a detailed report with Montana Tech and the Montana Department of Natural Resources in April 2011. The report included all transmitted data, sonar scans, and photographs. Vasquez noted that the depth readings indicated the buoy had descended into water far deeper than should exist at that location. He acknowledged that he had no explanation for how this was possible. He recommended immediate closure of the area to public access and a comprehensive investigation involving state and federal agencies. The Montana Department of Natural Resources reviewed the report and responded in May 2011. The response stated that while the data was anomalous, there was no evidence of a safety hazard. The department noted that sonar scans showed normal depth and that no injuries or incidents had been reported in the area. The response concluded that the buoy had likely malfunctioned or been carried downstream by an undetected subsurface current. No closure was recommended. No further investigation was authorized. Vasquez attempted to secure funding for additional research. He contacted the U.S. Geological Survey, the Army Corps of Engineers, and several private foundations. All declined. In an email exchange with a colleague in June 2011, Vasquez wrote that he felt the data was being dismissed because it didn't fit within expected parameters. He noted that the buoy's final transmission had been clear and unambiguous, 190 feet of depth, in a location charted at 12. In August 2011, a local news station in Great Falls ran a brief segment on the phenomenon after a reporter learned about Vasquez's study. The segment included an interview with Vasquez and footage of the circular current. The piece generated some public interest, but no official response. The Montana Department of Natural Resources declined to comment beyond reiterating that the area was safe and that no hazards had been documented. In 2013, Lindstrom, who had moved to a position at a university in Colorado, attempted to revisit the site during a trip to Montana. She arrived on July 9th and found the area unchanged. The circular current was still present, still moving in the same pattern. Lindstrom released several floating markers into the current and observed them for 2 hours. All circled continuously. None escaped. Lindstrom noted in her field journal that she felt uneasy near the water, though she couldn't articulate why. She described the current as purposeful, as if it's waiting for something. In 2018, Carver retired from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. In an interview with a regional outdoor magazine, he was asked about unusual sights during his career. He mentioned the circular current. He said it was the one thing he'd never been able to explain. When asked if he thought it was dangerous, Carver said he didn't know, but he'd stopped fishing near it years ago. He said it felt wrong. Today, the circular current remains. It appears on no official maps or navigational charts. The Missouri River flows past it, steady and cold, moving northeast toward distant waters. Recreational users pass through the area regularly. Most don't notice the 30-foot section where debris circles slowly, endlessly, in a pattern that rivers shouldn't follow. And somewhere beneath that circling water, 12 feet down according to every measurement, there may be depth that shouldn't exist. A place where a research buoy descended through 190 feet of darkness before its signal stopped. The current continues, the circle holds, and nothing that enters ever seems to leave. The river flows on, indifferent and cold, carrying its secrets downstream, but in one small section, the water moves the wrong way, and keeps moving, and waits. There is a line in the Little Belt Mountains where the air changes temperature in a way that air shouldn't. The Little Belt Mountains rise from the plains of central Montana, a modest range compared to the Rockies to the west, but rugged and isolated nonetheless. The mountains run roughly northwest to southeast for about 75 miles, reaching elevations just over 9,000 feet. The terrain is a mix of dense lodgepole pine forests, alpine meadows, and exposed granite ridges. Streams cut through steep valleys. Wildlife is abundant. Human presence is sparse. A few ranches occupy the lower valleys, and Forest Service roads provide limited access, but much of the range remains roadless wilderness. The area has been inhabited for thousands of years. The Blackfeet, Crow, and other indigenous peoples used the mountains for hunting and spiritual practices. White settlers arrived in the late 1800s, drawn by rumors of gold and silver. Small mining operations were established but never produced significant wealth. By the mid-20th century, The mountains were largely abandoned to nature. The Lewis and Clark National Forest, established in 1906, now manages most of the land. Weather in the Little Belts is variable and sometimes severe. Temperatures can swing dramatically within hours. Sudden storms are common. Meteorological monitoring in the region began in earnest in the early 1950s, when the U.S. Weather Bureau established several remote weather stations to improve forecasting for agricultural regions on the plains below. The temperature anomaly was first documented in June of 1952 by a weather technician named Harold Lindstrom. Lindstrom was conducting a routine inspection of a weather station located at approximately 7,200 feet elevation on the eastern slope of Big Baldy Mountain. While hiking between monitoring points, Lindstrom noticed an abrupt temperature drop as he crossed a small clearing. He recorded the observation in his field log, noting that the temperature on one side of the clearing was 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 57 degrees on the other side, a difference of 11 degrees within approximately 5 feet of lateral movement. Lindstrom checked his thermometer for malfunction. It was working normally. He crossed back and forth several times. The temperature differential was consistent. Lindstrom reported the observation to his supervisor, a meteorologist named Eugene Vasquez, who dismissed it as a localized microclimate caused by cold air drainage or shading. Such phenomena, while unusual, were not unheard of in mountainous terrain. Lindstrom accepted the explanation, but noted the precise coordinates in his log: 46 degrees, 54 minutes north latitude, 110 degrees, 37 minutes west longitude. The anomaly might have been forgotten, except that Lindstrom encountered it again in August of the same year while conducting a survey along a ridgeline approximately 1 mile north of the original location. The temperature differential was identical, 11 degrees, within 5 feet. Lindstrom marked the spot with a small cairn of stones and continued his work. When he returned 2 weeks later, the cairn was gone. Lindstrom assumed animals or weather had disturbed it. In 1973, a Forest Service ranger named Dorothy Merrick was conducting a boundary survey in the same general area. Merrick carried a portable weather station as part of her standard equipment. On July 9th, while walking a transect through a forested section near Big Baldy Mountain, she noticed her temperature readings drop suddenly from 74 degrees to 63 degrees. She stopped and took several readings, moving back and forth across the boundary. The drop was consistent and occurred within a very short distance. She estimated less than 10 feet. Merrick marked the location with a piece of surveyor's tape tied to a tree branch and reported it in her daily log. When Merrick returned to the site 3 days later, the tape was gone. She searched the area but found no trace of it. She marked the spot again, this time with spray paint on a rock. Within a week, the paint had faded to the point of invisibility, though Merrick noted that paint elsewhere on the trail remained bright and clear. Merrick mentioned the incident to a colleague, a hydrologist named Stephen Carver, who had worked in the Little Belts for several years. Carver recalled reading about similar temperature anomalies in old Forest Service records. He and Merrick searched the Dang An and found Lindstrom's field logs from 1952. They compared coordinates and realized Lindstrom's observations and Merrick's were along the same general line, running northwest to southeast across the mountains. In September 1973, Carver and Merrick conducted a joint survey to map the temperature boundary more precisely. They used handheld thermometers and walked a grid pattern through the suspected area. Over 3 days, they identified a continuous thermal boundary running approximately 3.2 miles through forested terrain. The temperature differential was consistent, 11 degrees, within 5 feet of crossing the line. The boundary did not correspond to any visible geographic feature. Elevation remained constant. Vegetation was uniform on both sides. There were no streams, rock formations, or other natural features that would explain the temperature difference. Carver and Merrick filed a detailed report with the Forest Service Regional Office in Missoula. The report included maps, temperature readings, and photographs. It recommended further investigation by meteorological specialists. The regional office acknowledged the report but took no action. In a follow-up letter dated November 1973, a supervisor wrote that the phenomenon was likely attributable to localized atmospheric conditions and did not warrant additional resources. In 1987, a graduate student in atmospheric sciences from the University of Montana named Angela Marquette learned about the temperature line while researching historical weather data for her thesis. Marquette reviewed Carver's report and decided to visit the site. On June 15, 1987, accompanied by a fellow student named Marcus Oleska, she hiked to the coordinates provided in the 1973 report. Using modern digital thermometers and GPS equipment, Marquette confirmed the temperature boundary. The differential was still 11 degrees, still occurring within approximately 5 feet. Marquette took extensive measurements, recording temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed on both sides of the line. The only variable that changed was temperature. Everything else remained constant. Marquette attempted to mark the boundary using biodegradable flagging tape, placing markers every 50 feet along the line. She photographed each marker and recorded its GPS coordinates. When she returned 4 days later, all the markers were gone. The trees they'd been tied to were intact. There was no sign of human or animal interference. Marquette and Oleska searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. Marquette included the Little Belt temperature line in her thesis, completed in 1988. Her advisor, a climatologist named Dr. Patricia Lindstrom, no relation to Harold Lindstrom from 1952, reviewed the data and found it credible but unexplainable. Dr. Lindstrom suggested Marquette submit her findings to a peer-reviewed journal. Marquette prepared a paper and submitted it to the Journal of Applied Meteorology in early 1989. The paper was rejected. Reviewers stated that the phenomenon, while interesting, lacked a plausible physical mechanism and required more extensive data collection before publication could be considered. In 1996, a team from the National Weather Service conducting a regional climate assessment included the Little Belt Mountains in their survey area. A meteorologist named Dr. Raymond Kowalski led the team. Kowalski had read Marquette's thesis and was skeptical but curious. On August 3, 1996, Kowalski and 2 assistants visited the site with advanced meteorological equipment, including infrared thermometers, anemometers, and data loggers. The team confirmed the temperature boundary. Kowalski's equipment recorded an 11-degree drop occurring within 4.7 feet. Infrared imaging showed a clear thermal division visible as a vertical plane cutting through the forest. The plane was precise and unvarying. Kowalski set up data loggers on both sides of the boundary and left them in place for 2 weeks, recording temperature every 5 minutes. When Kowalski retrieved the data loggers on August 17th, the data showed the temperature differential had remained constant throughout the entire period, regardless of time of day, weather conditions, or solar radiation. The boundary did not shift. The 11-degree difference persisted whether the ambient temperature was 50 degrees or 80 degrees. Kowalski later described the data as physically implausible, but verified. Kowalski prepared a report for the National Weather Service and submitted it in October 1996. The report included all data, infrared images, and detailed methodology. It concluded that the Little Belt temperature line represented an unexplained meteorological anomaly and recommended further study involving geophysicists and atmospheric physicists. The National Weather Service reviewed the report and responded in December 1996. The response stated that while the data was unusual, it did not pose a hazard to public safety or have implications for operational forecasting. No further action was recommended. Kowalski attempted to organize a multi-agency research effort, but was unable to secure funding. In a 2003 interview with a regional science magazine, Kowalski said the Little Belt temperature line remained the most puzzling phenomenon he'd encountered in his career. He noted that the boundary had been documented consistently over 50 years by multiple independent observers using different equipment, yet no scientific explanation had been proposed. In 2009, a journalist named Thomas Aldridge visited the site while researching a feature on Montana's unexplained phenomena. Aldridge brought a digital thermometer and confirmed the temperature differential. He also attempted to mark the line with orange spray paint on rocks and trees. When he returned 3 days later, the paint had vanished. Aldridge examined the rocks and trees closely. There was no fading, no weathering, no abrasion. The paint was simply gone. He tested the same spray paint on other rocks 100 yards away. That paint remained visible for weeks. Aldridge's article was published in a regional magazine in September 2009. It generated some local interest, but no official response. The Forest Service, when contacted, stated that they were aware of reports of temperature anomalies in the Little Belts, but had no active investigations or concerns regarding public safety. In 2017, a group of amateur weather enthusiasts organized a trip to the temperature line after reading about it online. The group, consisting of 5 people from various parts of Montana, visited the site in July and documented the boundary using smartphone apps and consumer-grade weather instruments. All confirmed the 11-degree differential. One member of the group, a woman named Jessica Brennan, later posted on a weather forum that the experience had unsettled her. She wrote that standing on the line felt wrong, like being in 2 places at once, though she acknowledged this was subjective. Today, the temperature line persists. It appears in no official meteorological databases. It is not marked on any maps. The Forest Service does not publicize its existence, though rangers in the area are aware of it. Hikers occasionally stumble upon it and report their observations online, but the phenomenon remains largely unknown outside of a small community of weather enthusiasts and researchers. The line runs 3.2 miles through the Little Belt Mountains, cutting through forest and meadow, indifferent to season or weather. On one side, the air is 11 degrees warmer, on the other, 11 degrees colder. The boundary is precise, repeatable, and unexplained. And if you try to mark it with paint, with flags, with anything that says, "This is where the impossible happens," the markers disappear within 72 hours, as if the line refuses to be seen, prefers to remain quiet, invisible, patient. A division in the air that shouldn't exist, but does and has for over 70 years, waiting in the mountains, unmarked and undisturbed. 11 degrees, 5 feet. No reason, just the line and the cold that waits on the other side.